Well, welcome everybody. This was a little bit of a late start, but we're coordinating with Ron in the Netherlands. We've got people all over, so it took a little bit of activity, and that actually is a reminder that that is Mike about to jump on. So 1 second, and let me get Mike on here. We had a little technical problem, but I find we have one of those in every event, and I just have to deal with it. So that's Mike jumping on, and hopefully he'll get there. And who he got here is just an amazing lineup. You're going to have a ball with this. We've got Mitch Steele, Vinnie Cilurzo. We have Ron Pattinson and Mike Karnowski. That's who I was just talking about. Mike's coming on now. There he is. He
Hey,
just jumped
everybody.
on screen. Awesome. And I hope this time you're seeing everything you're supposed to see, Mike.
Yes, I see everybody. I see everybody's handsome faces.
But some exclusions. I'm here. We are going to be discussing the origins and evolution of the IPA. I think this is going to be marvelous, and I can't wait to learn more. We've got a lot of beers to taste. I know not everybody was able to get the beer, but those of you that were in driving distance of Zebulon Brewing in North Carolina had one of the 450 cases of this beer that they brewed special for this event. I'm Doug Piper, and I'm with Gourmet Brewing in Greenville, South Carolina. And I want to thank you for spending time with Mitch, Vinnie, Ron, and myself. We want to make your day a little more delicious, one sip at a time. And that's what it's all about. So you don't want to see me. Let's bring these guys up on screen, and hopefully we can get everybody there successfully. I didn't quite do it there. Let's see. Mitch, I made you full screen. There we go. I tell you, it's always a challenge. Please write in the chat and let these guys know how much you appreciate them volunteering their time with us today. For Ron, I think it's about 8 p.m. in the Netherlands. And I want to thank Mike and Mitch and Ron for even making this possible for Gourmet Brewing, because they chose our audience for this event. So I appreciate that. Also, please note your preferences in the polls. I use those to shape future events like this one. We have a couple coming up that are really good, but I'm especially interested in your feedback for Lars Garshol. Lars has a lot of topics he could talk about, and he wants to know what the audience wants. So first of all, let me introduce this elite group. The first one I'm going to start with is you, Mitch, and Mitch is the Brewers Association winner of the Russell Shearer Award from Innovation, the author of the Brewers Association Brewing Techniques, Recipes, and the Evolution of the India Pale Ale. And he's been brewing professionally for 33 years and the co-founder of New Realm Brewing. So, Mitch, thank you so much. I appreciate you joining us this morning.
Yeah, it's good to be here, Doug. Thanks a lot. And thanks, Mike, for putting this whole thing together. Super exciting.
Ron, we'll go to you next. Ron is in the Netherlands and is a software engineer and a prolific, I can underscore, prolific author of beer history. Ron, I think I counted 33 books. Is that right?
No, it's more than that. It's over 40 I've done, really. Even I don't know how many there are. There's okay. A lot of them. I've really slowed down. I used to do 4 or 5 a year, but I'm now only down to about one a year. So, yeah. But a load of stuff.
You guys are giving me an inferiority complex. I'm the only one here who hadn't written a book. And I'm not interested in writing a book. Ron has the Shut Up About Barclay Perkins blog, which is a fantastic blog on beer history, mostly on the history of British beers. We also, by pre-recording, have Vinnie Cilurzo. Vinnie would have been here, but he had a conflict with this date, so he pre-recorded a fantastic interview. And we will play that in about the second portion of our event. He is the brewer of the first commercially brewed Double and Imperial IPAs in America, or really the world, has numerous awards over the years. Twice named Brewery and Brewmaster of the Year, author of Homebrew All Grain Brewing. He also received the Russell Shear Award for Innovation in Brewing, and he received the Brewers Association Recognition Award. That is a big one. And then we have Mike Karnowski. Mike is the owner and brewer of Zebulon Artisan Ales in Weaverville, North Carolina, formerly heading up the specialty beer program at Green Man in Asheville. He's also an author, the author of Homebrew All Grain Brewing, and he is the brewer of the delicious beers. I'll switch to the side camera. For those of you that were able to get these, that is just 4 of them. And so I'm looking forward to tasting those in just a minute. So I appreciate everybody joining us this morning. I'm going to knock you guys off for just a moment while we had some new people here, and I want to catch them on how the event flows. So we'll see you guys in just a second. So if you're a first-time viewer, these are monthly events with subject matter experts. This is the 68th free major event, thanks to supporters like Luke Pernotto, which helps me with the copywriting. And everything is crowdfunded via Patreon. And I want to give a shout out to Michael Pizzoni. He is a retired Army, and he's recently taking a biochemistry in brewing at St. Louis University and graduates next month. I know he's got a big clawhammer 10-gallon brewing system, and he's a regular at Sierra Nevada and Russian River. So thank you, Michael. Appreciate you making these events possible and your contributions. If you'd like to join the team and support these events, you can click on the green button down there at the bottom to learn how you can help. These are all 100% crowdfunded. Now, back to our event. Up in the upper right-hand corner, probably maybe up in here, you'll see a follow button. Please use that. I'm going to be doing a bunch of live events at breweries. I actually did one at Zebulon not too long ago. Wasn't my best, but I'm working on it. I've got some new gear, so it'll be fun. Refreshing your browser solves most technical issues. Reducing the resolution rate in the gear in the lower right-hand corner will sometimes help if you're having resolution issues. Please share in the chat where you're from. Submit your questions in the Ask a Question field. Small questions you can put in the chat, but if it takes any time to answer, it's better to put it in the Ask a Question field, almost down there at the bottom center. And again, please answer our poll, especially the Lars question. Thanks to those that have chosen auto registration when you sign up. And please don't hesitate to contact me if you're looking for a speaker, virtual speaker, or a private or virtual event, because I do help with those and would love to help yours. Now, coming up, I'm working on some really great events. We're going to do some live streams from the Classic City Brew Fest, and we're also going to be contacting Steve Hamburg in that. We'll be doing real cask condition ales and beer engines down there. We'll also have Olivia DeClerc from Brasserie DuPont in the fall. I'm also going to judge at GABF and the Craft Beer Conference. So I'm going to bring you there, and we'll do some live streams from there. And then we've got Lars Garshol coming up. So again, please mark those in the chat. So, Mike, I want to bring you up on screen so we can talk about these beers. And Mitch, I'm going to turn off your camera and Ron's camera, and we'll see if we can't get just Mike and I on screen. There we go. Hi, it worked this time. It did not work earlier.
Technology.
All right. So again, Mike, thank you for doing this. This is a lot of fun, and I can't wait to. I've got these are Ron's beers that I've got here on the screen, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about these.
Yeah, the box set of 6 beers, 4 were following the evolution of IPA in England, and then the last 2 in the box set were focusing on early West Coast U.S. IPA. So the four English ones that are in the box set that we'll be drinking along with today starts off with an 1840s IPA. We call it the original IPA. And that's one that was aged in oak barrels for 14 months with Brettanomyces. Started off hugely bitter, 160 IBUs of East Kent's. But, after 14 months in the barrel, it comes out, it's softened a lot. It's funky. It's mouth-coating resin. Just a really amazing beer. Think of it kind of like a double Orval is how it sort of tastes. A little more bitter, but I've always said that Orval was probably the last remaining example of a 1850s English pale ale in the world. So in 1840, this would have been a very typical recipe. This wasn't styled off any brewery in particular. Just that's what they would have used. Would be 100% pale malt, a boatload of East Kent's, and then aged. There wasn't a lot of variation from brewery to brewery as far as the recipe goes. That's all they had was pale malt. There were no crystal malts or anything at this point. So this would have been the same probably in 1770, would have been the same in 1860. It really, this beer covers a full century of IPA. It really didn't change much during that time. The second bottle, we go to pre-World War I, 1902. And this was really the heyday of English beers. I mean, the World Wars and temperance movements really destroyed English beer. But at this period, right around 1900, everything was 6-7%, at least. That's the weaker stuff would be 6 or 7%. Everything was big and flavorful, and this one actually is fairly low. I mean, it's only a 1050 gravity beer, and I'm sure Ron will talk about that. IPA was really a session beer of the time. A pale ale would have been stronger than an IPA back in the day. So it's kind of hard to wrap our mind around that today with this terminology, but IPA really was a lower alcohol beer and of all the beers available. And it's weird that an IPA would be a session pale ale, but that's the facts of the matter. So 1902, you're drinking just pretty much what we would call the classic English IPA. Homebrewers would think of that, as a classic, Maris Otter, East Kent Golding, 70 IBUs. But then we switch and we get a post-World War I from the same brewery. So they're both Whitbread IPA. And so it's the same beer from the same brewery, 16 years apart. And the only difference was World War I. And you can see that it's dropped from 1050 down to 1033. The IBUs have dropped from 71 to 43. So it's really not. It took a big hit. But I think as you drink it, you'll still see that these brewers did the best they could. That it still retains the overall profile, I think, of the 1902. It's just lighter overall, but it's still balanced, and I think it still holds up as a style. But then we go to 1946, which is right after World War II, and this is kind of the end of the road for IPA in England. It's kind of like IPA in America now, where it's kind of a meaningless term. You throw on something as a marketing term, and this is the IBUs are down to 26. The OG bumped up a tiny bit, but it's never going to get any better than this for the most part. IPA is just a golden bitter in England at this point, and there's really no meaning to the term. There are a couple, holdouts like Worthington White Shield or something, but in general, IPA by the 1940s is it's just a golden bitter, and so that's where we leave England, and then we switch over to Mitch and go on to the rebirth of IPA and the birth of craft beer in America with the 1974. But the English ones, as far as the going to the West Coast, the 1974 is based around Anchor Liberty Ale. It's 100% American pale malt, 100% Cascade hops, clean ale yeast. So, the Cascade hops, it doesn't really hold up to modern palates. It's subtle, a little hint of grapefruit, but it's, for these people that are used to, 3 pounds per barrel dry hop of Galaxy, it's going to seem very tame. But with all these beers, I try to tell people, try to get into the head of that time. Don't just judge it based on, the modern beer. You have to go back in time. You have to be like, well, World War I was just ended. It was, the buildings are on fire and there's shortages and everything. So it's more fun if you can, not maybe more fun, but you can appreciate the beer more, getting into the mentality of people. And in 1974 in America, I mean, Nixon was still president. We're still in Vietnam. It's, all marijuana has seeds in it. It is a very different time. And virtually there was nothing on tap other than light American lagers. That anywhere you would go would just be light lager. And I think to imagine yourself in 1974 in a bar and the bartender hands you one of these and says, it's a new brewery that just opened up and it's a new style of beer, it really would blow your mind. Even though nowadays you look and it's kind of just a subtle, hoppy, pale ale IPA. But and then the final beer is the birth of the double IPA, styled after Vinnie's own recipe from 1993 for Pliny the Elder. And this is not, people are going to want to compare this to a modern Pliny, but this is very different. This is a Pliny from 30 years ago almost. And so it's fairly crystal malt heavy. The hops are very old school, Columbus, Centennial, a little bit of Simcoe in there, which I think he was the first one to be using Simcoe. And this one, I mean, it's very nostalgic. I'm sure Mitch and I, when we taste these beers, it takes us right back, to almost, when we were younger men. And it's very nostalgic in that satisfies for us. I don't know if it'll satisfy for the new money drinkers or not, but then again, I'm just saying, don't compare this to a modern Pliny. It's a very different recipe, very different hops, and a different time. So if you've got the box sets, I appreciate you supporting Zebulon and our endeavor to go back in time and explore these old styles and enjoy the beers.
Well, John Palmer says he wants one, Mike, so I hope you saved a set.
Sold out. None
Sold
left.
out.
I got one set for Ron.
Well, speaking of Ron, that's a great segue. He's next. So if you don't mind, I am going to switch to Ron. Thank you very much. These are great. We'll see you in just a minute, Mike.
All right.
All right. We will bring Mr. Ron back on screen. There he is.
Hello.
Hello in the Netherlands.
Yes, all the way over here in the other side of the Atlantic. Yes.
Yeah, and it's going to bother me really bad, Ron, with me drinking these in front of you.
Yeah, well, I'm the only person who's not getting to drink any of these beers, but the only thing I can say is at least I've got St. Bernardus Abt in front of me, so it's not like it's a complete disaster.
Well, I won't rub it in your nose too soon. We'll do that, I think, a slide or two, couple of slides in. But first thing, before you jump into your slides, Ron, you've researched, I thought 33 books. You said 40 books.
Yeah,
but
something
when you
like
do
that.
your research and you did it on IPAs, was there a surprise in IPAs that was just unexpected when you first went in?
Yeah, low gravity.
Low gravity.
Yeah, how many of the ones from the 1840s weren't very strong at all? Yeah, just weedy beers. That's all I can say. So, stuff that was like kid strength for the early 19th century. So I'd say that was the most surprising thing. No, just generally that it's like everything. Most of the stuff people had said about IPAs was complete and utter bollocks and wrong. But we'll get into this when I do my presentation, and I will explain just exactly how everyone's been completely wrong about where they've described the history of IPA.
Well, that's as good a reason to jump into your presentation then.
Okay. I should share my screen, shouldn't I?
Please, or I can do it.
Oh, you can do it. I'm going to select the window. Yeah, that's the right one.
Not seen it yet, but it should pop up as soon as you. There it goes.
All right, you can see that there then?
Yes, I do.
That's good. I've got some crap on my screen I have to get rid of. Anyway, can everyone see that? My
yes.
My slides? Okay.
Yep, it looks perfect. I just did that, Ron, so I was trying to get it. There we go. So can you read that okay?
Yeah, I can see that fine. So, okay, I guess away we go. I am going to be telling you now about the history of IPA, which may not be exactly what everyone thinks it was. But I mean, one of the things that I call it the beer empire, and that's the thing to realize. It's a beer which is inherently linked to the British Empire. Without the British Empire, it wouldn't have existed. And it's a very imperial sort of thing. IPA is something which has been loads of different things in Britain over the years, and trying to come up with one specific definition of IPA, of British IPA, is actually completely impossible, because the term IPA has been used for very different beers over a very long period of time with loads of different characteristics. So to say, oh, there's one thing which was English IPA is basically impossible. But that's true of every single beer style in the world, I would say. So you shouldn't really get too hung up about that. Original IPA. What was it like? I've heard loads of different theories about what it was. People who are saying it was, lots of different things, but I don't believe a lot of them. And you can see that over time it changed a lot. IPA, it was lots of different things at various different times. At some points, it was a couple of different things at the same time. So for the sort of the modern idea, thinking, IPA is some strong beer that's really heavily hopped, that doesn't necessarily apply to the whole history of IPA. And I'm going to demonstrate some of this with, different recipes and lots and lots of numbers, which is the thing I'm really interested in. Early IPA. When I was preparing for this talk, I started looking through the newspaper archive for references to pale ale in India. And I got a whole load of ones from the 1780s and onwards. And none of them said India Pale Ale. And you don't really know much about what the beer was like. One of the things I can say, there were only 3 beers that seemed to be imported into India. They were pale ale, porter, and surprisingly small beer. So really weak beer. The idea that it comes from October beer, I really don't get that. People might have got confused, because what you find is in the 19th century especially, people are always going on about their pale ales that they were brewed in October, but this was because they were stock ales. October was the best time to brew them, and so you would anything you wanted to be a stock beer, you would probably brew it either in October or March, but preferably October. So just saying that a pale ale was brewed in October doesn't make it an October beer. And so the most likely thing is, when you see how they described the original pale ales, it was pale ale as prepared for India. That's the term that comes before India Pale Ale. And so what that says to me is, well, it was probably just a standard London Pale Ale, which had been prepared for export to the Far East, which meant they would have hopped the bugger like hell. And so it has nothing to do with it being an October beer. Just saying it was brewed in October just means you were brewing it as a stock beer. And so my guess is it was just, and because the original breweries like Hodgson's, they brewed the pale ale for India, were in London, it would have just been their standard pale ale, which would have been if it was a common ale, a beer of around probably about 1070 or something like that, that they just hopped up like hell so they could send it to India and it wouldn't go off. And that would be my guess about the origins of India Pale Ale. And when you look at the later beers, that looks right, because you don't see anything. Okay, I've seen a couple of outliers, which were things which are called IPAs, which are like 8, 9, or 10% ABV, but they're real outliers. There are a couple of beers, and the vast majority of them weren't over 7% ABV. And we're going to see this when I go through, as I always do, lots and lots of lovely numbers. I mean, when it kicks off, Hodgson, the general story is true. Hodgson did have a pretty much complete monopoly. He annoyed people in the trade, and so other breweries moved in, and they basically took over from him. So you see that Hodgson has a virtual monopoly on the original trade, and then Bass and Allsop move in because people are pissed off with Hodgson, and they eventually take over most of the trade. But it wasn't a huge amount of beer. I mean, if you're looking about this 20,000 barrels of stuff, I mean, this was really small beer for the British breweries at the time. If you're looking at the big London breweries in the 1840s, they were brewing 500,000 or 600,000 barrels a year. So 20,000 barrels isn't a huge amount of beer. It's not a really big deal. You look at the original characteristics. They wanted it really pale. That's why they brewed it from the best. That's why the Burton breweries mostly had their own maltings, because they wanted to have the beer really pale. So they wanted to have their own malt that they used. They brew it in a certain way to keep the color really pale. So they're really keen on having a really pale color. It's hard to come across exactly what that color was. I think way paler than modern English bitter, and not as pale as lager, but not that much darker. Wasn't particularly strong, and it was always brewed as a stock ale, which meant that it was matured for a long, long time before it ever got on a boat or went anywhere. So it was a beer that was going to be aged for at least 6 months and probably a lot longer. And one of the big things about preserving the beer wasn't high alcohol, it was the high degree of attenuation. So the high degree of attenuation meant that the beer had, when it was in the ship, it had nothing for anything nasty to eat on. And that's one of the things they seem to have been very deliberate about doing, fermenting the beer all the way out and making it really flat before they put it on the boats. So it's true, hops are involved, but it wasn't alcohol. Attenuation was more important than that. the whole thing about water. I mean, you see the thing originally. You have some of the London breweries like Truman's, who buy a brewery in Burton just to brew pale ales because the water's right there. But you see this really, and so this is a big thing, like in the 1860s, 1870s, before people work out what water chemistry was. And then when they do, people generally just treat the water and don't go to the places where the water's right. They're very keen on keeping the colour of pale ale really pale, which, given the name was pale ale, it's not so weird. And so they did various things in the brewing process. So they didn't do a long boil. They didn't do a boil in a closed copper like they did in London with their porters, where they wanted to get some colour from the boiling process. They're very keen to keep the colour very light. And then you see later on, when they're allowed other ingredients, that they're using loads of sugar and they're using things like rice or flake maize, not because it was cheaper, but because they want to keep the colour and the body of the beer very light, because that's what people expect from a pale ale. Yeah, and unions. Do I have some more? Yeah, I've got some more stuff about unions. Unions are not fermenting vessels. Unions are cleansing vessels. So, if you look at the old days in British brewing, you had two stages of fermentation. You have primary fermentation, which you do in rounds or squares, open top vessels. And then you have the second phase, which is the one where you get all the yeast out, which is called cleansing. And you do it in various different ways. And Burton unions, they were basically a mechanized system of the one they'd used in London, which was called pontos, where you have these big barrels, you have them leaned over, and the yeast had come off the top, and then they take it off by hand and bug around with it like that. And unions were basically a mechanized system of doing that. So all they're on about is getting the yeast out of the beer. They are not about fermentation. It's a yeast removal system. And loads of breweries had them. Everyone who was brewing pale ales installed them. You had loads in Scotland. You had them all over the country. I don't know why. What someone said to me about what the big problem with Burton unions was, they were virtually impossible to keep sanitary and to keep clean. And that's why most breweries did away with them, because there was so much, because you've got all this wood, just a nightmare. So this is my first recipe. This is the first recipe I came across in brewing records for an IPA. I used to think it was Reed until I found out that it was miscatalogued in the archive, because I saw some other Coombe records and I realized this couldn't be Reed records. I realized it couldn't be a Reed record. Because it comes from the Watney Coombe Reed set of records, my guess is it's from Coombe. But I have no actual idea who it came from. It could have been from anyone, but I think it was from Coombe. But you see, it's got a very, it doesn't have a huge gravity. It's, it's not a particularly strong beer. At least not for early 19th century standards, when beers tended to be, when a standard mild ale would have been this strong. IPA in India. It's always a good one. People think everyone drank IPA in India. It's not true at all. In fact, way more porter was exported to India. And in fact, porter was the drink of preference of the ordinary soldiers in the army. It's only the posh people who got to drink IPA. And so, in fact, if you look at all these things from the East India Company, generally they're acting for about twice as much porter as they are IPA. So my guess would be at least double amount of porter got exported to India as IPA, because that's just what the ordinary soldiers who were over there drank. And you see that during the, well, I'm going to have to think of the right term. Used to be called the Indian Mutiny. I'm not sure what the right term for is it now. But during that period in the 1850s, when a lot more British troops were sent over to India, you see the amount of export India porter being brewed in London suddenly really shoots up, because obviously they were sending beer out to serve all these troops in India, all these extra British troops. And it shows you that that's what the ordinary soldiers were drinking. Well, they tried to stop them drinking rum because they all died if they drank rum and arak. So there's various reports from British Army doctors saying make them drink porter because otherwise they don't die as quickly. So when I was saying about about how a lot of the beer that got exported to India wasn't particularly strong, this is the first set of actual real numbers that I have about IPA, and especially IPA being exported to India. And you see that some of it has got gravities in the low 1050s. So it's not particularly strong beer, but what they all have in common is a really high degree of attenuation. And you have to remember that at this point in the UK, most beer would have been at most 75% attenuated. So stuff that's like 90%, that's incredibly highly attenuated. So these are beers which are all actually exported to India, which is what makes it interesting. And you see that they average out not really that strong. Well, quite high in ABV, but that's because they're very highly attenuated. In terms of OG, not that high. You look at mild, a London mild at this period would have been probably higher OG than 1060, probably about 1065, so higher than that. It's really interesting when it comes to IPA being sold in the UK. The story was that there was a shipwreck no one had evidence for, and then Martin Cornell actually managed to track it down because the date had been wrong. But what it more seems to be like is that it was people returning from India, because I've read a few reports about people who came back from India, and when they were going to posh dinner parties, what they wanted to drink was IPA, because that's what they, not wine, because that's what they got used to over in the colonies. So I think that's partly what it was. But even when they were selling it in the UK, it was still a stock beer, and it was still aged for a really long period of time. These are another set of IPAs. These were sold in the UK. And honestly, something that's got a gravity of 1044.7, that is like a table beer. That's like the stuff you give the kids in the 1840s. That's a really, really low gravity. And this is, and these gravities are way below the gravities of the weakest mild ales that you'd be having. The original IPAs, they were all stock ales. They weren't aged the same way that that porter and stout was, where porter and stout that would always be put into big vats for aging. IPA always seems to have been aged in trade casks, i.e. casks you weren't going to actually send out into the trade. So nothing bigger than hogsheads. And then you get later on, they start doing sort of like semi-stock versions, but the original classic pale ales were all stock ales that were aged for stupid lengths of time before being sold. These are sort of the ages that you get for aging different beers. And so you can see that, yeah, AK, which is one of my many obsessions as a beer, like pale ale, that only had a couple of weeks. So basically down to the pub cellar and sold. Yeah, Bass Pale Ale. Yeah, I mean, the way Bass IPA, well, it was never called IPA, it was only ever called Pale Ale. the way that they aged that was completely crazy. They just stuck it out in the brewery yard in stacks, put a few bits of straw over it maybe, left it for 9 or 12 months, and then put it on the ship to India. But I mean, the thing they said was that when a beer had gone through this sort of tough love, that it was incredibly stable and could put up with anything basically. So you can sort of see why they were doing it, but it seems totally crazy to me. Yeah, the domestic versions of these strong pale ales, they were still aged for a long time, not quite as long, but I mean still a long, long time, and completely different to modern IPA. And here's a sign of some really crazily highly attenuated versions of Bass. So like, yeah, I mean, some that are virtually completely fermented out. And this seems to be pretty typical of the late 19th century IPAs, that they were extremely highly attenuated. Scottish IPA. This may be something that people may not associate Scotland with IPA, but in fact, Scottish brewers were really into the IPA trade, partly because they were very big exporters of beer. And so obviously they were going to start brewing the beer that people wanted in export markets. It's also why Scottish brewers got into the lager trade very early, because they're very heavily into exports. And so you see a lot of IPA being brewed in Edinburgh and exported in really large amounts to all over the world, and was probably as important a site as Burton, Edinburgh and Alloa. And originally they hopped them like crazy, just like the Burton ones. But especially for the domestic market, as time goes on, you see they really, really drop the hopping rates. I assume because Scottish people like their beer not quite as bitter. When you see IPA coming on in the 20th century, then you see that generally the hopping rates are going down. Everyone stops brewing it as a stock ale pretty much, apart from in Burton, where you have a completely different sort of pale ale existing. So you have so they're still brewing things in Burton that are pretty much like the original IPAs. So stuff that's over 1060, mostly for the export trade, but they still seem to be selling some of it in the UK. The draft version of Vast, that goes down to about 5.5% ABV, so still by modern standards something quite strong, but it's all starting to change. And you have the whole pale ale and IPA thing getting completely mixed up, because you have brewers like Whitbread, where the first pale ale they brewed was called PA. It was a beer of like over 6%. When they started brewing a beer called IPA, it was weaker. So it's quite often whereas anyone nowadays in the US would think, well, IPA is always going to be stronger than a brewery's pale ale, whereas that wasn't necessarily the case back in Britain. And so particularly in London, you have with Whitbread and Barclay Perkins, where their IPA is a lot weaker than their pale ale. And it's just what the market expected. And so you see that in the 20th century in London, IPA becomes something quite different. This is an example of now I would say that this beer, this is one of the beers hopefully you're drinking, unlike me, who's just sitting here with nothing to drink. Anyway, this is one of the beers and for the period 1902, a beer of just under 1050, that was actually and not particularly high gravity. Their mild would have been stronger at this point. So I think their mild at this point was about 1055. So this is not a strong beer, but it is quite heavily hopped. And so it's more heavily hopped than the pale ale was. So it's a strange sort of thing. So the heavy hopping thing seems to live on in Whitbread IPA, even though it's not that strong a beer. I hope I'm confusing everyone here with what the hell IPA is, because I'm confused. I don't really know what it was either. And so you see these sorts of low gravity IPAs, and it's really typical in London in between the wars that IPA seems to become a quite hoppy but fairly low gravity bottled beer. And you've still got some beers like that today. So Harvey's still brewing IPA that's like that. Harvey's is, well, obviously the best brewery in the world anyway, but because they're crazily old fashioned. But they still brew a beer called IPA that's about 1030, but quite heavily hopped. And what you find happens in Britain, that these sort of IPAs sort of go into this type of beer called light ale, which is basically extinct now in the UK, or almost, which is a really, a 3% bottled pale ale that's not very interesting. Basically, it might explain why it doesn't really exist anymore. But it used to be a huge thing, light ale. And this is where these low gravity IPAs end up. They end up being sort of like light ale, this thing it's like the current Harvey's version of IPA is, I think, 3%. Probably not even any more than that. I think it's only 3%. But it's this tradition of IPA, which is a completely different one from what Americans think of as IPA. This is a recipe for a Whitbread IPA from just at the end of World War One. So, pretty weak, but actually fairly bitter as well. So, I mean, Whitbread seem to have stuck with this, that they really hopped their IPA quite heavily, even when it was a really weedy beer, and they hopped it more heavily than they did their standard pale ale, even though the pale ale was stronger, which is, probably confuses everyone. So you see, after World War II, you still had a couple of beers which were pretty much like original IPA. So in particular, White Shield and Bass Red Triangle, which in the 50s were like 6% plus beers. So basically pretty much like the classic IPAs. I mean, I must say, Worthington White Shield was a wonderful beer. It used to be one of the few beers that was still bottle conditioned in Britain, and you could get it fairly widely. And it was wonderful, especially if you mixed it with draft Bass, which is what I used to do. So if you mixed it with draft Bass, you'd end up with something about 5.5%, 6% ABV in a pint. So lots of fun. But it was I think it still exists, Worthington White Shield, not really in the form it used to be. It's a wonderful label as well. And one of the classic beers when I was younger. So here's some examples of these sort of things. Blue Triangle, that's the non-bottle conditioned version of Bass Red Triangle. But you'll see just like crazy rates of attenuation on some of these. And obviously some of these beers that we're still brewing to be sold in Belgium. So there's a big trade in British Pale Ale and Stout and Scotch ale in Belgium. And so, yeah, quite a few breweries in Britain were either brewing beers especially for the Belgian market or tweaking their beers that they normally brewed for the Belgian market. And this is Boddington's IP. So Boddington's Bitter, as people would know it. You know, whether or not this was an IPA, I don't know. But they still called it IP and inside the brew house. And to me, that says IPA. So I'm going to take that as an IPA. Yeah. Really light, very highly attenuated, a simple beer. I mean, I quite liked Boddington Bitter, and it tasted a lot bitterer than the 26 IBUs, I would say, mostly because it was very highly attenuated. So, because there was very little residual sugar left in it, the bitterness that was in there really struck you. So a lot of people would say, oh, you know, they remember Boddington Bitter being a very bitter beer. And when I looked at all the sort of recipes, I was looking, well, it doesn't come out as that bitter a beer, even though I remember it as being more bitter than that. And I think it's purely because it was very highly attenuated. And so the bitterness was more obvious because there wasn't anything else getting in the way of the bitter flavor. And that's me done. Otherwise, other than trying to encourage you to buy some of my books, which are really excellent, have lots of recipes in, and well, lots of stuff of me talking about crap, basically. But yeah, over to you, Doug.
All right. What I was going to do, Ron, is I thought I would line these up. I'm going to turn your slide off for just a second because I thought it was interesting to look at the color differences. The flavor differences are unbelievably different, particularly the first original barrel aged. And I think I've about got these lined up and just give everybody a little idea of what we have here. And there we go. I will focus. It is not you or me. There we go. All right. So I will take them from start to finish. All right. So the very first one in the group is this. This was the original IPA, which was the barrel aged. The second in the group is this, which is the, let me make sure I've got these right, the 1902. So again, the 1902. And we've got the 1918 is here. And then the very last one, which is the 1949. So that's how the color and clarity vary. Most are clear. I would say the most cloudy is the original, and that's probably because it has that 158 IBUs. I suspect that would add a little cloudiness to it. But yeah, what a fantastic discussion, Ron. I love that. I hate that I had to drink in front of you.
Oh, no problem. Oh, God. I've got beer at least, so it's not that catastrophic.
All right, we have 13 questions, and I'm going to ask you to kind of go through them quickly because we've got Vinnie coming up next. So
okay,
let's see if we can knock out these questions pretty quick. So as we transition to the questions, again, we've got two more segments coming. We've got Vinnie next, then we've got Mitch Steele. So hang in there. We'll do questions and we'll switch over. But this is going to be fun. Let's kind of do these rapid fire if we can, Ron. And if you look through the questions, you don't have one, but you want to push it up to the top, everybody gets one vote on a question. So that way we answer the most important questions first in case we don't get to the end. Okay, our friend John Palmer has the most popular question. Does stock ale imply Brett?
Yes. In a word, yes. Not just Brett. As I've been learning more about British beer aging, probably quite a lot of other stuff that isn't actually Brettanomyces, but some other sorts of yeast. But yeah, basically stock ages is Brettanomyces. That's what gave the stock flavour for the most part. But there would have been other yeasts involved in that as well.
And what a perfect rapid fire answer. Yes. Okay. Chris has the next most popular question. What hops did you use for the first 3 historical IPAs? Was it EKG mostly?
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, you'd have to use EKG because the earlier ones, that's about the only modern hop that's still the same.
Yeah, and that's on the bottom.
Don't EKG. Don't get me started on that. EKG, what they sell as EKG is not necessarily Goldings. It's
right.
What's marketed as EKG is a whole load of related hops, and probably none of them are actually related to the one that Mr. Golding have first isolated.
We're getting a lot of comments. Don't get you started, Ron.
but it's EKG is a marketing term, which is for a load of closely related varieties of Canterbury Whitebine. So a whole load of similar hops, but whether or not they're Goldings or not is another matter. So I mean, for my old recipes, I always put in Goldings just because that's, especially when it's a London brewery, which is what the first IPA recipe was. They'd have been getting their hops from Kent. And so
Andrew has a popular question that I hopefully won't get you fired up.
Oh, right.
So Andrew asks, how were the breweries in the late 19th century able to get such high attenuation? The example recipe doesn't seem to be mashed for very low or have sugars that would ferment out. Is Brett the single reason for this extreme attenuation?
Yes, when you see the stuff that are things that are taken from analyses of the finished beers, yes, it's because of Brettanomyces. That's why we're getting a really high degree of attenuation, because they had these beers for 12 months in the barrel with Brett, and it had eaten away at everything over a long period of time. I mean, you look at the attenuation rates of the British beers in the late 19th century, it's amazingly better than most lagers. I mean, most lagers, they're struggling to get over 65% attenuation in the late 19th century. Other than, if you look at Czech Pilsners, they're better. They're up around 75%. But the Bavarian lagers are rubbish. I mean, really low degrees of attenuation. Some when you look at the bock beers, I mean, really dreadful. So like 50%, or even worse. So, but yeah, basically Brettanomyces, and good skillful brewing. So if you look at beers which have loads of Brettanomyces in them, they'd be getting them out to 75% at least, or a bit more. But Brettanomyces is what got them out to 85%, 90%.
So Craig asked a similar question about Brett, which I think ties into the previous one. Do you think Brett was responsible for all of those attenuation figures, or English yeast that will chomp and chomp and chomp if you leave them in long enough?
The really high levels, it was all Brett, I think. because they left them a long time. So the things we see in the analyses, they're finished beers. So they're beers that have gone through the whole process, and that's all secondary conditioning. That's Brettanomyces.
Next question. Dimitri has a very popular question here. The first beer in the series, the 1840 original, is aged with Brett. Can you talk about whether they pitched Brett on purpose, or was this simply a common contaminant from the casks?
Well, no, they didn't pitch it because no one. Well, they probably did pitch it because it was probably in the pitching yeast. Was it a contaminant? No, it wasn't a contaminant because they wanted to have proper secondary conditioning. So it wasn't a contaminant because that's what did the secondary conditioning. People didn't understand the process. I mean, this is the whole thing about aged beer. People didn't know in the 19th century what it was that was doing this. They suspected it was some type of yeast, but they didn't really know. All they knew was empirically, if you stuck this stuff in barrels and left it for a couple of years, then it fermented out like crazy and wonderfully. So yeah, it was a combination of two things. But what you see this when they started trying to use pure yeast cultures later in the 19th century, British breweries got really annoyed because secondary conditioning didn't work. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. And when it didn't work, that would mean, well, yeah, because you didn't have it in pitching yeast. When it did work, it meant, well, you'd still got the Brettanomyces in the secondary conditioning vessels, and that's why it did work. And this is why British breweries were really, really reluctant to go over a single strain yeast cells. And most of them, even into the 20th century, weren't using single yeast strains because empirically they hadn't worked very well for them. And it was mostly because, at least in the 19th century, they hadn't understood the role of Brettanomyces. But they knew empirically that if we did this, then it worked. So why should we use pure yeast strains when it messes up our process?
All right, good question, Dimitri, a very popular one. Next one, along the same line, did they get such high attenuation? Was it the sugar? So what did sugar have any factor in it all?
No, well, I mean, you're looking at the earlier ones that there's no sugar in them at all. In the 1844 ones, then sugar wasn't legal. Sugar wasn't legal in English ales until 1847. So no, it wasn't just because they were using sugar. Later on, you'll see that they use sugar and they use things like rice and maize in pale ales.
And they use what, Ron? I didn't understand you.
They'd use things like corn and rice and sugar to help the attenuation and to keep the pale and the body and the color really light. But when you're looking at the old ones, no, that was just done purely with yeast.
All right, a really interesting one here from Adam. Adam asks, how did you calculate historic IBUs?
Right, how do I calculate historic IBUs? Well, for me, what I do is I just stick it through Beersmith and see what it comes out with. And I would always say these are calculated IBUs and not real ones. Much the same as most modern beers. I mean, most modern beers that have an IBU figure on them, it's not actually a measured IBU, it's one they've calculated. And if you saw the actual measured IBUs, they would be much lower. All I've done is I mean, some of the things, a lot of the early recipes, I actually reduce the quantity of hops, partly to take into account sometimes they're older hops and stuff like that. So I knock the quantity of hops down, and I still get calculated IBUs that come out crazy, sometimes like 190. I mean, just completely insane. Things which aren't which aren't actual possible values, ones which are obviously higher than you can really get.
So the short answer, you use Beersmith, but you also use your experience to kind of adjust it.
Yeah, I mean, so the ones I put in the recipes, they're the ones I get at Beersmith, but I will adjust the quantities depending on what the age of the hops are. So if a lot of the hops are 2 years old, then I'll knock down the hop quantity by 25%. To take into account
So you think they're reasonably accurate once you
Yeah.
kind of do the calculations and
your own
hunches.
so I'm in fiddle around with them. I mean, one of the things you see though sometimes is with some of the classy beers like the IPAs and the strong stouts is they're using all fresh hops, so they're using stuff that's all from the most recent season, and then you just come up with completely crazy values. Because then I'll put them in the full numbers, and you're talking about insane amounts of, you're talking about with the IPAs of like, I don't know, 12 pounds of hops per barrel. So really, really crazy amounts of hops.
Well, and Mitch adds there in the comments that the max IBU in wort is about 120, and that higher gravity worts can get a little higher, but you reach a limit there.
Yeah,
Great
sure.
question, Adam.
I'm sure he's right, but I mean, the thing is that you have to realize that in the old days, when they were throwing all those hops in, they weren't doing it for the IBUs. They were doing it for the preservation character of the hops.
Yeah.
So, and they weren't even necessarily doing it for flavor either. It's just purely to preserve the beer. So they couldn't care less how many IBUs the beer had. They were using the hops for a very specific purpose, which was to stop the beer going off.
All right, we're going to take a couple of more, and then we will move on to Vinnie's presentation. Here's a quick and easy one because it's yes or no, Ron. Is it possible to get a copy of your presentation as a PDF?
Yes, just send me £100 and then I'll whiz it off your way.
May I share a link to it?
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay, good. All right, and if I forget, somebody don't hesitate to email me, but I will try and
Or
put out
don't
a link.
don't hesitate to send me £100 either.
Yeah, even better, or buy your book. Well, speaking of that, the recipes, I haven't seen it yet, but I know there's going to be the question about the recipes. Are they either in a book, or is that something else you can share?
Well, they're in the presentation.
Okay, so we'll use that.
Yeah, they're on the.
All right, so we've hit Brett. Let's see, question for Ron. This one might be long, so you keep it short because it's about EKG. Merlin, my buddy, says, question for Ron Pattinson. Given what you said regarding EKG not being the same as the classic Goldings, is the Goldings hops that are sold commercially nowadays not the East Kent Goldings like the originals?
No, there are a whole load of different things. There are a whole load of closely related varieties to Goldings. I mean, from what I heard from the best, I'm not a hop expert. The guy who I asked for all my advice about hop expertise said the chances are that the original Mr. Goldings hops no longer exist anymore. But all the stuff that's sold as EKG is a whole load of very closely related varieties. So it doesn't really matter.
Well, Ron, that was fantastic. But we've got Vinnie coming up next, and Mitch is going to introduce it. We'll taste a couple more beers. I know it's late where you are. What is it coming on about 9:15 p.m. your time?
Yeah, it's 9:15. Yeah.
Are you going to be able to hang on and add some things in the chat? Or are you going to
Yeah.
disappear?
I'm gonna hang around.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. Mitch, we're going to bring you up on screen. And so thank you, Ron. I'll knock your camera off and we'll catch up. That was awesome, my friend. Thank you so much. Cheers.
Cheers.
All right. Now, if we are successful, and sometimes bringing camera up after it's been off a while is tricky. Ha! It worked. I was so worried. It actually went down while Ron was talking. And I was sitting there clicking the button. Come on, Ron, get your camera going. And he wouldn't come on. So always worry about that. That's a quirky thing with Crowdcast. So, Mitch, I'll tell you, Ron always is just fascinating, isn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. You always learn something listening to Ron talk about beer.
Well, without a doubt. But we've got Vinnie next, and we've got a beer to drink. So I'm going to slide all these beautiful beers off to the side. And why don't we get out the next couple? And I think our plan for those that have the beers is to have our 1974 right before the presentation, and then at the end we'll pick up the 1994. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Let me make sure I've got them right. I have to put on my glasses. Darn it. All right. So I'm going to line these up, and while I pour the beer, do you want to introduce a little bit about this is basically is a Liberty Ale, and talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so a couple things about Liberty Ale, and that's what this beer is based on. Number one, it was, and I'll talk about this a little bit when I get to my slides, but the Anchor Brewing Company, owned by Fritz Maytag, and he bought that brewery in the 1960s and really spent about 10 years cleaning it up and getting rid of all the infections and all that kind of stuff that was going on in the brewery when he bought it. But he was very much a beer scholar, or he is a beer scholar, and he was fascinated with the idea of European beers and what they could be as compared to what was going on in the United States in the 60s and 70s. And I interviewed Mark Carpenter for my book on IPA, and Mark told me the story of Liberty Ale, and they were inspired by English beers, and they went to England and were pretty disappointed in what they found. They didn't think it was really reflective of what they thought it was going to be. But they did like the whole idea of dry hopping, which really, with a few exceptions, wasn't done in the United States. It's certainly not with American lagers, which were the dominant beer style at the time. And so and Fritz Maytag was definitely inspired by a beer called Ballantine IPA, which is one of the few IPAs that survived Prohibition in the United States. And he wanted to brew something that was reminiscent of that, because in the mid 1970s, Ballantine IPA was just about gone, and so they set out to brew something that was dry hopped and had some really nice hop character. And this was one of the first craft beers, in general, and also was one of the first beers to feature the Cascade hop. And it's fascinating to listen to somebody like Mark talk about how this all came about. But Anchor Brewing deserves a ton of credit for really bringing the IPA hop into existence. And one of the things a couple of the first craft brewed IPAs weren't labeled as IPAs, and this is one of them. But it is an IPA in all sense of the word, or the phrase. So yeah, it was a favorite of mine when I got my start in brewing, and I haven't had one in a while, so I'm looking forward to trying this, and I think I will do that.
I would, and in my part of the area, or woods, as I was about to say, it is extremely difficult to get a fresh Liberty And I was very thankful when the Brewers sent me one that was less than a week old from Anchor, and it was delicious. Cheers.
Cheers. Oh, my. That has got some hops, right? That's fantastic. I have very fond memories when I first started brewing in the 1980s in the Bay Area of California of going to one of the very first multi-taps, and it was Lions Pub in Dublin, and they always had Anchor Liberty on tap, and I really got a huge appreciation for what that beer was and for IPAs in general by drinking that beer. It was always very fresh, right?
Yeah, the embarrassing thing was when I was talking to Mike about this beer, and I said, well, of course, I guess they use Liberty hops. And I was quickly corrected.
The first version that they did was to celebrate the anniversary of the ride of Paul Revere. And they did not use Cascade hops, and it didn't come out the way they wanted. And so the next year they did it, and they decided to do it with Cascade hops, and the rest is history.
Well, it's a delicious beer. It's just really hard to get in our part of the world, and I appreciate Mike brewing this up because they are. I would love to grab it all the time. It's just delicious. Well, that takes us into your conversation with Vinnie. So can you kind of introduce that, and then we will transition to that?
Yeah, certainly. So when Mike first approached me about doing this project, one of the things he wanted to do was get a conversation with Vinnie on tape. And Vinnie and I have known each other for a very long time, and he was quite agreeable to do this. And we did this about a month ago. I was on vacation at the time, and Vinnie was at the brewery. And we had planned about a 15-minute talk and, just hitting upon, the origins of Blind Pig and Pliny the Elder. And we ended up talking IPAs for almost an hour. And that's what this interview is. And it's a very casual conversation. It's, if we were sitting in a bar or a pub and talking about India Pale Ales, that's what this would be like. It was really casual and a lot of fun for me.
All right, so for the audience, we are going to transition and we're going to switch to session 2. Now, you may see something drop off and change on your end, but you really don't have to do anything. It's kind of like I'm switching channels, and the important part about doing that is so that we won't run out of time. So I will end this session. I will click on something. It'll bring you forward. It might take us a minute to get there, but we'll do that, and then I'll say something, and we'll start right into the video. So hang on, don't leave. We have Vinnie coming next. Okay. I hope everybody is here. Let me get the rest of our crew back. That takes a moment. And there we go. There's Mitch. And we'll get Ron. And we will get Mike. There we go. Okay. I'm sorry, there's a little transition there. I don't have a producer. This is a one-man show. Those of you that have been, whoops, wrong camera. No, it's just me. So I have to switch all this stuff, and it takes just a moment. So my apologies to that. So with this, guys, we're going to switch over, and we're going to check out the conversation with Vinnie. So hang on. And I tell you what, I will take it full screen. And I will turn your cameras and mics off. There we go.
Okay, it looks like we can get going here. Vinnie, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate the time and look forward to chatting with you about India Pale Ale.
Absolutely. Thanks for asking me, Mitch. Really appreciate it. Yeah, it's a style of beer near and dear to both of our hearts.
Absolutely. Yeah, this should be a fun conversation. So I have a few questions that I want to ask you, but you know, if this delves off into different directions, that's okay too. So you know, we want to talk about some of your history with Blind Pig IPA and your first brewery in Temecula. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you if you remember the very first India Pale Ale you ever had.
Yeah, it probably would have been, I'm going to guess, because it would have been in a bottle. I'm going to say it was probably Grant's. You know,
okay.
and then you know, okay, do you consider Liberty Ale an IPA or Celebration an IPA? So, you know, maybe some gray area with those two beers, because I certainly had Liberty and Celebration before I had a Grant's, but probably the first labeled bottle, it'd probably have to be Grant's. I'm guessing.
Yeah, I think that was one of the first ones I had as well. It was the first one that was actually labeled as an IPA after craft got going. So that's a pretty special beer.
Yeah, absolutely. I was homebrewing them around that time.
Okay.
And had a real focus on you know, on American hops, and I honestly don't remember the flavor profile of Grant's. I don't think it was like hardcore American West Coast style IPA. I think it was more English style, if I remember. So it was pretty mild. So it wasn't until I had Rubicon IPA in Sacramento that really that was like, okay, this is the direction I want to go. And so I put a lot of credence on Rubicon IPA, and that's breweries, as you know, is now closed, and it's forgotten by most, you know, beer enthusiasts. But Rubicon IPA is a legendary part of the IPA story, that's for sure, in America.
You know, it's really cool you brought that up, because that was one of the first real American IPAs I ever had, and I remember it clear as can be. I was at a beer festival in the Bay Area, and Phil was there, Phil Moeller, who was the first brewmaster at Rubicon, and he said, "Hey, try my IPA," and I drank it, and I'm like, "Holy crap, this is hops, man! This is nothing but hops." And I just thought it was the best thing I ever had. And you know, I was working at San Andreas at the time, which was a little brew pub down in Hollister, and I went back and I'm like, we got to brew an IPA. We got to brew an IPA. And Bill Millar, I don't know if you know Bill, but Bill wasn't into IPAs at all, or anything stronger than 5% at the time. So I had to kind of just put it in my back pocket, the idea, and do it later.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I would go up to classes at UC Davis, you know, weekend short courses and whatnot that Dr. Lewis was teaching. And I just couldn't wait to get out of class and drive to Sacramento and drink Rubicon IPA. And I would normally then finish my trip, you know, and tag an extra day on and get a hotel. There was a Motel 6 that was 8 or 10 blocks, and stay there so I could park the car and go down and just drink as much Rubicon IPA. And I don't know if you remember, this was even before glass growlers. So they had the plastic bag in a box, and they called it a Rubikube. And so it was I could tell you, I'd bring an ice chest and I'd take a gallon of Rubicon IPA home, and then, you know, get home, and Natalie and I would drink a gallon of Rubicon over a couple days. And by the second day it was a little flat and whatever, but it was such a beautiful beer, and, you know, and using all old school hops. And I you know, maybe we'll get to that part of the conversation, but you know, back then there wasn't all the designer hops like there are now.
Yeah, exactly. All right. So when did you start Blind Pig in Temecula?
That was 1994. I'd been
Okay.
homebrewing starting in '89, and so I started homebrewing IPAs in '89, and then 5 years later started the brewery with a focus on hoppy beer. We also made a golden ale. You might remember we did a Blind Pig golden ale, and that was because at the time there was no way you could be an all IPA focused brewery. That was it would have been impossible. As it was hard enough to sell Blind Pig IPA.
I need to tell you this. The very first time I had one of your beers was when I was with Anheuser-Busch, and I was doing new products with Anheuser-Busch, and we had rolled out some new beers in the San Diego area, and we went to Pizza Port in Solana Beach, and I remember I had one of Tommy's IPAs first, and Tommy was there and he showed us around and everything. It was just a really neat visit. And we had, I think it was it Swami's maybe?
Yeah.
I think, and I'm tasting it going, holy shit, this is like one of the hoppiest beers I ever had. And then Tommy goes, well, you got to try this one. And it was yours. And I was like, oh my God. And honestly, I those kind of moments are so inspiring. I went back and brewed an IPA on the AB pilot system, and we served it at the Great American Beer Festival one year, and it was one that got a line. I felt really proud of it, and then we never did anything with it, of course.
I remember two things that you mentioned. Swami's, that was the second beer after Rubicon that inspired me, and when I decided to go pro, I had never extrapolated a recipe up from a homebrew 5-10 gallon batch to I had a 7-barrel system at Blind Pig, and I reached out to Vince Marsaglia, the co-founder owner of Pizza Port with his sister Gina, and I said, hey, can you give me some advice on how to extrapolate a recipe up? And he goes, oh, here. And he just gave me the Swami's recipe. And he goes, I've had your homebrew before. I know you're not going to copy me. Just use it as a guide. And I did that. And I used Swami as a guide. And a few years ago at the Great American Beer Festival, we were having dinner on the last night at a steakhouse, and the Pizza Port crew was in a private room in the back and happened to wander back, and they pulled me in, and I got to tell that story to all these young Pizza Port employees with Vince and Gina there. It was really cool.
That is cool.
But yeah, so Swami's was a huge part of our foundation of what IPA was at the time, and and I remember also sending you a keg at least once of Pliny at Anheuser-Busch for your homebrew club.
Yep.
Back east,
I remember that well, and thank you again for that, because we used my wife and I, Kathleen and I, had a Super Bowl party every year, and we always turned it into a big beer tasting event. And we had the homebrew club come, and cool. We had. I think we actually asked for the Pliny for the homebrew club Christmas party, and not our Super Bowl party. Right. But we always said, they both happen around the same time, obviously. And my memory's a little shaky, but thank you so much. And I can tell you that club, which included a lot of really great brewers, Michael Fairbrother, who's now Moonlight Meadery, and Paul Davis, who recently passed away, and some other people that went pro. We were super excited. That was just one of those things that I think that was probably right after the Craft Brewers Conference or World Beer Cup when I had that beer somewhere, right. And maybe judging or something. But yeah, it was definitely an inspiration.
Well, thanks.
So yeah, back to Blind Pig. You've talked about what kind of beers you were brewing, mostly hop forward beers. Did you ever brew an English IPA at home brewing or at Blind Pig?
Never. No, I was always focused on American hops. Yeah. And it wasn't that I was anything against it. I just, I had this love for these these hops. And when I wandered into the homebrew store at the time in San Diego, Beer and Wine Craft was out in El Cajon, and there was 2 bags of experimental hops. I didn't even know what experimental hops were at the time, especially in 1989 as a young homebrewer. And one was CFJ4 and one was CFJ90. CFJ4, never know what happened to it. Steve Dressler and I still dream about that hop. But CFJ90 became Centennial. And so I was using it as an experimental at the time. And that was I was already using Cascade and Chinook, but that was pretty foundational for my focus on hops was finding that hop, and then it eventually becoming commercial and becoming Centennial.
Yeah, which is still one of the best hops in the world, I think. It's one of my favorites for sure. So you've become pretty well known for people giving you credit for inventing the double IPA style. Can you tell us a little bit about that first beer that became a double IPA?
Yeah. So the first one was actually called Inaugural Ale. It was the first batch of beer that we made at Blind Pig. I think I wrote on the label double IPA, and that was really just because I doubled the hops of what my regular IPA recipe was going to be. And then I took the malt up. I didn't double the malt. I probably took it up by 25 or 50%, whatever. And that was really the foundational idea of the recipe. But the bigger picture looking from above was that, we had this equipment that I bought used from a guy in Bisbee, Arizona, Electric Dave, who was actually in jail at the time for selling marijuana mail order. I made the transaction while he was in jail. And so I technically bought the equipment from his then girlfriend, Sylvia. But it was plastic fermenters. The kettle was an old soup kettle from the military base next door to Bisbee. And I just thought, well, I need to brew a really big beer to, cover up any off flavors if there are any. And it turns out that, and I was getting yeast from Chris White before White Labs even existed. He was doing his research at UC San Diego in La Jolla. And anyways, that was the foundation of it. That beer actually, I then dry hopped it over time, multiple times. And it also had oak chips in it. And the oak chips part of it was specifically because Ballantine IPA was aged in oak barrels. Years later, I learned that those were pitched barrels and there wasn't really maybe an oak contribution, if I remember correctly, although you could probably tell me better from your historical, writing of the book and all. But anyways, that oak flavor became a part of those early IPAs, and I actually would add a little bit of oak chips to all of my regular Blind Pig IPA as well. Okay. So when I dry hopped with pellets and whole cone, I would throw in some a little bit of oak chips as well.
Oh, never knew that. That's cool.
Yeah.
Awesome. So what do you remember about the recipe for that beer? What kind of hops did you use in it? And, were you at the point where you had figured out you didn't want to use a lot of crystal malt yet in that beer?
Yeah, it was. So from the malt standpoint, I would actually drive up to Great Western Malting they had a plant in Los Angeles, and every Wednesday, small breweries or home brewers could go and basically fill these cardboard drums up, and before we could get a silo, but I could buy malt at bulk malt pricing, and I'd get them in these bins, and I would drive up every Wednesday and do that, and as much as I could to save money, and then eventually we got a silo. So that was our base malt. There was some carapils in it, and there was crystal malt, but it was still a pretty minimal amount, under 5%. So it was low compared to what other, especially English IPAs, probably 3-4%, maybe 5% tops if the color had dropped a little bit. And early on, there was also some wheat in it, and that was the side of me as a home brewer that said, well, the higher protein levels in the wheat will help with head foam proteins and whatnot. But pretty simple, straightforward malt bill. Hops were bittered with Chinook, and then Cascade, Centennial, and then eventually I could get Columbus. And although Columbus Tomahawk had been released before 1994, it was still pretty hard to get. So it wasn't but maybe 6 or 12 months in that I started incorporating Columbus into the recipe. So, I think that's a really important part of the American IPA story, is the fact that there were no designer hops available at the time. It was a 19... what was that, in 99 or so, 98, 99, when you had Amarillo and Simcoe come out, and which were definitely the first two of the designer hops. I know there was a couple hops that Yakima Chief had released before Simcoe, spacing on the one hop that Stone used to use in the Pale Ale. Maybe they still do. It was Autonum. Yeah. So Autonum was YCR 001. I think that had already been released. Warrior had been released, but it wasn't until Simcoe that over time it took off. And but yeah, those hops didn't exist. So as brewers wanting big bold beers, flavors from hops using American hops, that's what it is. And I find it comical now that a lot of these small hazy IPA brewers are actually going back and incorporating, and they're discovering Chinook for the first time. Whereas for you and I, that's all we had,
Right.
And and Citra and Mosaic make it so easy. I mean, a 5-year-old kid can make an IPA with Citra and Mosaic, and I'm not knocking those hops. They're beautiful, amazing hops, but they make making IPA so much easier.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And it's interesting that the Amarillo and the Simcoe, I remember when both those hops were released, and I was with Anheuser-Busch, and I remember Gerard Lemons talking about Amarillo. He was a big proponent of that hop, and I was able to get my hands on some back when I was homebrewing still with back in New Hampshire, and I brewed an IPA that was 100% Amarillo, and I won some medals with it. It was pretty cool.
But Gerard was a big part of my hop journey as well, because he was my salesman for Yakima Chief, and he's the one that brought me YCR 014 first, which was eventually became Simcoe. And so I was using that in our single hop beer. He was the one that brought me Amarillo and taught me a lot. I learned more about hops from him at the time than anyone. So.
Yeah, he was fantastic.
Yeah.
And speaking of Simcoe, one of the things we wanted to ask you about was, just kind of, your take on how much of a game changer Simcoe was for the industry and also for you as a brewer.
Yeah, that became that. I did that single hop beer with YCR 014, I think in 98. And then we made Pliny for the first time. I think that was 1999 for a double IPA festival at the Bistro in Hayward. And, I think there was like 5 or 6 beers at that festival, and including Stone. I guess it probably been Ruination. But anyways, this hop comes along, do a single hop with it. Before I even dry hop the single hop recipe, standard recipe we use all the time, just pulling the glass and smelling it and going, I've never, ever had anything like this before. And this wasn't even dry hopped yet. I'm like, what's this beer going to smell like when I dry hop it? So we dry hop the beer, and it's, the beer turns out amazing. We send it out to accounts. The next single hop I did was Warrior. Well, Warrior is an amazing bittering hop, and we still use it in Pliny, but it doesn't have a lot of aroma and whatnot. And we had accounts that were like almost sending it back because people wouldn't drink it because the Simcoe was so impactful. But Simcoe instantly became the cornerstone in time around the Pliny recipe, and it still is. Of all little tweaks we make in recipes over the years, Pliny the Elder still has a primary focus on the hops on first Simcoe and second Amarillo, and that still carries in Pliny the Younger as well. And Simcoe was just so forward with the grapefruit and pine and pungent. And, it was also the hop that I learned years later about picking windows, and how if you, grow, or if you have Simcoe that's picked early, it's going to be more grapefruit driven. If you're going to have Simcoe in the middle of that picking window, it's going to be a little more pine, and then towards the end it can get pungent. And if you can maybe get between that early in the middle, you can get a little bit of grapefruit and a little bit of pine. That knowledge didn't come to me till years later, but at the time, it didn't catch on quickly, though. We started making it as a seasonal. It wasn't until 2004 that Pliny became a year-round beer. That was the year that Natalie and I reopened the brewery after I'd left Corbel and had traded them my severance for the name and or the hop yard, actually. And it was in 2004 that it did start taking off, and but it was slow. It really wasn't until 2010 that it really exploded. And so it took some time, and it took time for consumers to get a taste for it. But I've had conversations with Mike Smith from Loftus about this, and we've sketched this out on the back of a napkin. You can watch the trajectory of, I'm always backwards with these cameras.
Yeah, right.
The trajectory of Pliny going up in sales, and at the same time, Simcoe as well. And there was a point there, and I don't know the exact year, it was sometime in the early 2000s, where Simcoe got down to 1 acre. They had 1 acre of Simcoe left in the ground. I remember there was a point when I don't know if it was Mike Smith or Gerard or someone told me, and I learned years later it was true, that they actually dumped 50,000 pounds of Simcoe hops because there wasn't anyone out there buying them. And it was us at Russian River, and then a handful of breweries that were using it. And then finally it took off. But I'm flattered that Natalie and I were able to help the Peralts, the Carpenters, and the Smiths, the three families that own the rootstock to it, that we were able to be a part of the success of their, these small family farms that were really struggling at the time. The hop industry was a mess. And I was just happy that Simcoe came along, that, Jason was a part of breeding it, and we used it in the beer, and Pliny took off. Brewers started, drinking Pliny, asking what was in it. And Simcoe started selling, and they started planting more, and the rest is history. And now it's been 22 years, since it's been out. So it's not a new hop anymore. It's an older variety at Amarillo.
Yeah, it's crazy. And talking about, as you got into, your time with your own brewery at Russian River, I remember, I wanted to tell you this story. I remember very clearly judging at World Beer Cup the very first year they had double IPA as a category, and Tom Nickel was at the table. And so he went through and schooled everybody on what a double IPA was. And I'm just there soaking all this stuff in, It's like, look, if it's a double IPA, it can't have any crystal malt. It's got to be hoppy as all get out. And it's got to be dry and all this stuff. And then I think it was a few years later that you and him did a talk at one of the CBCs on double IPAs. And
right.
I actually really took a lot of notes during that talk, and I went to Stone very shortly after that. And I remember talking to Steve Wagner, and he was telling me about how he really picked your brain on IPA and double IPA hop profiles, and really incorporated a lot of what you taught him into beers like Ruination IPA and Stone IPA.
Yeah.
So,
well, thank you. That means a lot. And I love Steve to death. He's a long time friend. And one point on your comment about talking about Tom Nickel was, and why he probably was so emphatic about the crystal malt being low to none, was that at the time there were so many IPAs that had a ton of crystal malt in it because they were trying to mimic the English IPAs. And somehow, and I don't know the science behind this, somehow English hops do okay with crystal malt. and maybe it's the sweet earthy notes that those hops have with the crystal malt, but just doesn't work with the American hops. And at the time though too, you had a lot of brewers trying to figure out, well, what's the difference between double IPA and a barley wine? And that was one of the big, because, you know, okay, let's take Bigfoot, for example, from Sierra, you know, tons of, I mean, a classic American, you know, barley wine. If you drop out all of the crystal malt out of that beer, you probably now have a double IPA. You know, maybe it's not quite as aromatic as it should be, but it's bitter. It's got big hop notes. And so anyways, like that was something that we often would discuss at homebrew level or, you know, commercial level. If we were doing presentations, any of us that were talking, you know, over the years later, Matt Brenelson jumped in and was starting to do talks on these things as well. And that was something else, you know, I know he would also focus on.
Yeah, it's interesting, the whole crystal malt thing. And there was a period where people were accusing me of hating crystal malt, and which isn't the case. It just depends on the beer. But I like crystal malts in some beers.
Yeah.
But, you know, speaking of the English hop and how it interacts with crystal malt, one of the things that we found at Stone when I was writing the book and Steve and I were doing all the research on the book, for the book, you know, we brewed some English IPAs at Stone, and we found that the hop character stuck around a lot longer than American hops. You know, it lasted 90 days or 120 days. And, you know, American hops, they fall off, you know, it depends on the variety, but they fall off a cliff pretty quickly.
Really fast. Yeah.
And I think that might have something to do with the fact that they don't play well with crystal malts.
Yeah, I'm actually, it's been on my mind for a while to brew a English IPA finally. And I have a recipe in my mind. I have a name in my mind, and I'm gonna first brew it on our little 5-barrel system, same one that you have. I have a 5-barrel SS Brewtech, and so I'm very anxious to brew that and just do something for fun, and then maybe eventually do it on our 20-barrel, and then do some canning or whatnot as well.
Nice. I would look forward to trying that. You know, we did, when we started New Realm, we came out with an English IPA that I was just really happy with, and we called it Tap the Admiral, which is you know, a reference to people sucking beer out of the casks on the trip to India. But nobody wanted it, you know. It's it was a tough sell.
That's the problem, and that's probably why I'm not sure we can make one and get past our 5-barrel system. You know, could we maybe now with direct to consumer and you know, 2 gift shops, and you know, you have enough people buy, you know, a couple cans, but you know, it's not going to be people walking out with flats of cans like DDH or 12 packs of bottles of Pliny like we see, you know, on a regular basis. It's just not the taste. And I wish and hope that in a broader sense in the beer world, not just for IPAs, but in other styles, that in time consumers will, you know, broaden their palate and start looking to English style beers again, to Belgian style beers, and so on and so forth. You're seeing it with lagers right now, Helles and Pils. So I'm hoping that maybe this is the beginning of it. You know, IPAs, to me, and I've said this often recently, IPA is now like Chardonnay to the wine industry. It's pretty ubiquitous. You can pretty much, you know, tie Chardonnay to the premium wine category, and you can do the same with IPA to beer industry. And it doesn't just have to be, you know, craft beer. You know, obviously the big breweries now own a lot of, you know, craft microbreweries, and they're on, you know, the IPA bandwagon. You know, I was on a flight back from Denver yesterday, and the guy sitting to me is drinking an IPA on the plane, you know. So like, you can get it on the flight, you know, as now too, on a United flight. So.
Yeah, you know, it's funny because I was you know, I mean, for 25 years, I've been 30 years, I've been a huge fan of the style, but I don't think I ever saw this coming. And I remember somebody saying a few years ago to me, and I don't remember who it was or what the situation was, but this person said IPA is going to be the next American lager. And I'm like, that's crazy. And it kind of is, to your point, it's kind of moving in that direction. And really, there's hardly any breweries out there that aren't brewing at least one or two IPAs in their portfolio.
Yeah, I mean, if we were downstairs in the restaurant right now, I think we have 4 on right now, and the consumers just can't get enough of the hops, and which is great because that's big, bold flavors. People are moving up, but I hope that, like wine, where maybe someone starts with a white wine, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, and then they maybe discover reds, and eventually they work their way up to a big red like Zin or or Cab Zin, that sort of thing. If you're really crazy or going for some Petite Syrah, but then sometimes they'll come back and find the finesse of Pinot Noir, which is a beautiful, lovely, and the most difficult red wine to make. That's my hope, is that not that American IPA goes away. I love that that's where the palate went to, especially because I was involved with the style such early on when you couldn't give it away. But it would be nice to see some other styles and whatnot. And but yeah, I mean, you back in the day, like Blind Pig in the mid 90s, I had to make the golden ale, and I wasn't going to make a pale ale because I had way too much respect for Sierra Nevada and that beer and what it was and what it meant to me and how it inspired me. But now it's the opposite. Can you open a brewery or be in operation in America without an IPA? There's a handful of sour, funky focused breweries, at Crooked Stave, for example, and then you've got Belgian inspired focus like Allagash that, doesn't, but beyond that, there aren't, you have at least one IPA and probably multiple IPAs. So boy, have things changed in, 20 plus years that back then you could make an IPA, but you needed something to supplement it. Now you have an IPA or it's going to be pretty hard to be in business.
Yeah, and as a brewer, I love IPAs. It's definitely my passion, but I also like being able to brew other styles, and some of them are coming back. I'm very encouraged by the fact that our German Pilsner is one of our best sellers in our restaurant week after week, and but it's interesting, I think, too much of a good thing, maybe, to some extent, but,
well, and there's all these new hop varieties coming out. So, it does make it easy to create new flavors. But I don't know that we're going to get beyond the flavor profile of Citra, like how much it gives. And Mosaic would be right below it. Those hops just are so impactful, but Citra in particular. And you can use a tiny little bit. We don't use a ton of Citra. We use it just to lift other flavors. We have a couple beers that we focus, and they're the main hop, but those are secondary seasonal beers. But more recently for us, we built a whole IPA around the new hop Talus, which I've been rubbing, and we sponsored as an experimental, and just love that hop and love the pink grapefruit notes with just a little bit of mint on the background. So, the hop growers shouldn't be forgotten, and the hop breeders, the breeders, folks like Jason Peralt and, Chuck Zimmerman, who was his predecessor, who handed off Simcoe to him before, he passed away. And, it was unfortunate that Chuck didn't get to see, the success of the breeding program that he started. But, for the average person, they probably don't know that, like what you and I know, that it's a 10-year, or longer sometimes to get a hop to market. So, Simcoe comes out in 98, 99, whatever year it was. And, that means that Chuck had, started breeding it at least 10 years before that, so we're saying the late 80s. Well, who was making an IPA then? It's even, less. And how can you have this foresight? Well, Simcoe was actually supposed to be a bittering hop, and it turned out to have this amazing, aroma profile and was dual purpose at the time.
Yeah, and I appreciate you bringing up the impact of the hop breeders and the hop growers, with the relationship with India Pale Ale and India Pale Ale's popularity. I think, you know, and you and I, you've been involved with, you know, personal relationships with hop growers for longer than I have. But, you know, that was something when we started, you know, meeting up with hop growers and talking hops and things like that when I was with Stone, I realized how important that was and how beneficial it was for both sides of the brewing business, you know, and to see the excitement around new hop varieties and to see the growers and the breeders being really excited about new hop varieties. It's a pretty cool dynamic. And you know, when we were doing experimental hop beers at Stone, I'd always send a case to the to the grower who grew it, you know, and just, you know, just so they could see their hop in action with one of our beers. And you know, you really can't underestimate how important the vision of the hop breeders and the hop growers has been for the success of some of the best hops for IPAs that we have.
Yeah, well, they're listening. You know, they're talking to all these brewers that, you know, are in Yakima and the other parts of the Northwest for hop selection, and then, you know, you've got now the hop growers come into the Craft Brewers Conference every year, and this interaction, and they're talking, they're asking, the breeders are asking, so, you know, what are you looking for, and then, you know, it's not instant, you know, by any means that they're going to nail something and get something good, but they at least can get some insight from the brewers. You know, what I would love to see is see if the breeders can start breeding towards lower alpha acid, because it seems that the more impactful hops are higher alpha acid. And so, you know, then you say, well, what could we do as brewers if that was a lower alpha acid hop, and all those hops that we're adding at the Whirlpool aren't contributing to as much bitterness, because, you know, instead of being a 10 or 12 alpha like Simcoe and Citra and Mosaic are, you know, they could be, you know, down at like, you know, 3 to 6 or something like that. And maybe there's a direct correlation there between aroma and alpha acid. I'm not sure. You don't see too many highly aromatic hops that are low in alpha acid, though.
Yeah, that's true. And it's an interesting thing to ponder, you know, because whirlpool hopping has been a source of frustration for me, you know, and Stone did a lot of whirlpool hopping. And I remember when we finally got the ability to measure IBUs at Stone. And so one of the first things we did is we measured IBUs throughout the brew house process, and we were getting like 20% utilization out of our Whirlpool edition. It was crazy. And it was like, you know, and we just didn't know. And so before then we were discounting any bitterness contribution from the Whirlpool hops when we were formulating beers, and that was the absolute wrong approach because it's critical.
Well, and we around this mindset, we designed our new, what's now almost 3-year-old 75 barrel production brewery brew house. That was designed around the concept of removing as much hops out of the Whirlpool as possible, and we put a hop back in. So now when we finish the boil in the kettle, we pump the wort to the Whirlpool, it spins around, does its centrifugal thing, the hop break happens, and any pellets we added on the hot side, you know, end up in the center of the Whirlpool. But because Pliny first edition, the bittering edition, is extract, there really isn't that much hops in the, you know, in that true pile. And then when we're ready to knock out and cool the wort down, we pump the wort over the hops in the hop back, and then that hot wort, you know, extracts all those volatile, you know, hop oils, but we go right to the wort cooler immediately. So like, you know, less than a minute later, you know, the wort has passed through the whole cone hops. These are whole cones, not pellets, in the hop back. And then it gets cooled down. And the idea is that we've just locked in those super volatile and delicate hop aromas from the whole cone hops in the wort, and then off it goes to the fermenter. And so, but that idea was to really give us more tools in our toolbox to be able to control the bitterness that you reference that you get from the Whirlpool, you know. And then there's the kind of the newer technique that we what we call, and I think it's now industry term, is the cool pool, you
Yeah.
know, where you're cooling the wort down going to the whirlpool to make a hop addition there, but to be at a lower temperature so that there's, you know, less isomerization of the hops in the whirlpool. And that's a cool little trick for us to use and use the hop back as well. And
Nice.
control bitterness as well. And it, you know, and it brings back the need to add more bittering hops, though, because we just reduced so much of the bitterness from that whirlpool addition, like you talked about. But again, it gives us more control.
Awesome. Yeah. The cool pool thing, you know, when you have an automated brewery that wasn't designed for it, is a very big challenge to try and figure out how to do.
We just brought our welders back in and at least piped in cold liquor water, and it's a manual process. But for the last 3 years or two years, since, because we started doing it right after we built the brewery, and it was like, why didn't I think of that before? But we would run a 50-foot hose that ran through from the yeast room, through the hallway, by the lab, into the brew house, and they would just be in there with a 1-gallon hose and with a flow meter right there, and they'd be looking down. Okay, 5 barrels, shut it off. At least now we've got it hard piped in, and they can do it manually down in the basement.
Nice.
But yeah, it's not quite automated yet, but it's a great technique for those home brewers that are watching.
Yeah, it really is. It's very effective.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about Pliny the Younger and how that beer came about and how you approach brewing that beer in contrast to Pliny the Elder?
Yeah, so the idea there was 2005. So technically it would have been late 2004. So we reopened with Natalie and I owning the brewery in 2004, post Korbel, so kind of Russian River 2.0. And you know, it was like a lot back then. A lot of breweries were still making barley wines in the winter for a you know, February release or so. And I was like, you know, I like barley wine, but it wasn't my favorite style. So well, what can we do to keep the tanks full, stay busy in the slower months? It's like, well, let's take the Pliny recipe and bump it up. And, you know, then we start researching more about Pliny the Elder, the actual man, and we learned that he had an adopted son and nephew that was Pliny the Younger. And so the name, okay, we got the name. So then the next decision was, well, okay, Pliny's 8% elder. Are we going to go higher or lower in alcohol? And I did actually for a while have an inkling to go lower because you tend to get more impactful hop notes with
Okay. I hope that transferred easy enough and well, and I hope everybody got to see. We will come back to this. I want to bring Mitch up on screen, and let's see. There's Ron. There's Mitch. Hopefully Mitch's camera will work. I see it there. I'm not sure why it isn't bigger, but let's see. If I do that, there he is.
Yep.
Hello, Mr. Steele.
Hello. Yeah, it's kind of fun to relive this conversation, even though it was only a month ago. And you know, Vinny's just such a nice guy and such a good friend, and it was just a fun conversation, as I think some of you are picking up on. So we're gonna taste Mike's vintage American Double IPA. So definitely based on an early recipe for Pliny the Elder. Centennial Simcoe CTZ hops. So I'm pouring myself a little bit right now. Mike, you worry too much. The beer tastes great. That's really, really nice. A lot of peach. I'm getting a lot of pine. You know, one thing Vinny didn't talk about with Simcoe was, at least from my perspective, I tend to get a lot of peach on it when it's good Simcoe. And, you know, that kind of harsh flavor that people get that I saw some comments on is, you know, more that catty flavor, that English brewers really can't stand, and American brewers tend to embrace. But I think this is wonderful.
I'm not an American brewer, but I don't like the cattiness. So I'm with the British guys. But this is awesome. The peach and the fruitiness. I mean, I've never had Pliny, so Mike's will be my first, but this is.
And the bitterness is so clean on it. It's really nice.
Oh, gosh.
It's there. It's very present, but it's very clean.
But it seems a little sweeter than any of the IPAs in our lineup so far. Now, is that just me, or is it actually a little sweeter? Maybe Mike can tell us what the finished gravity was on it. Mike says alcohol sweetness.
Yeah, and that's something that I think is really important. And one of the things that I learned from Vinnie very early on is, when you're brewing a high alcohol IPA, it's a very effective technique to use sugar as an adjunct and bump up the alcohol that way instead of using malt, because the alcohol itself that you produce in an 8 or 9% beer is going to add a very strong perception of sweetness, and you don't need to augment that with crystal malt or low mash temperatures or anything like that. And after I got to Stone, one of the things that I did was I really dried out a lot of the beers that we were brewing, just because I thought it enhanced the hop character quite a bit.
Wow. This will get finished shortly. This is awesome. Yes, Steve, I have never had Pliny, but I hear that you have a bottle, so we might compare them. That is delicious. Well, before we jump back for the last few minutes, I think it's about 15 maybe or so minutes left with Vinnie. Is there a comment or two you want to make right quick, Mitch, before we switch back?
No, just that, Vinnie is the master as far as I'm concerned with American IPAs. And I just, he's done so many great things for the beer industry, and his relationship with hop growers, it's a very personal relationship. He's friends with a lot of the families that are big hop growers in Yakima and the breeders. He mentioned Jason Peralt, who is from Peralt Farms, and he's running the hop breeding company right now, and they're the ones that are coming out with the hops like Talus and Citra and Mosaic. And you really can't overemphasize how important their work is to the future of American IPA. It's critical.
Well, that might make a good program in and of itself. I love that idea. All right. We're going to switch then. We'll pick up the last 15 minutes with Vinnie, and then Mitch is next. We're looking at your questions. They're starting to accumulate there. So we will get to those. Again, vote them up, because if we run short on time, only the ones with the highest votes will get answered. So with a little luck, and if the technology here all cooperates, we will bring Vinnie back, I hope.
The alcohol will help extract, more of the oils and whatnot, but you have all that other flavor getting in the way. But, in the end, we didn't think that we could get enough body to back up the amount of hops that I wanted. And so we went higher. And so we turned, we turned an 8% alcohol recipe. Initially, it was 11%. Now we've settled in at 10.25.
Okay.
And the idea was to add more base malt and more sugar, but no additional specialty malt. So at the time, it had Carapils and some C40 crystal malt in it. About 3% of the recipe in Pliny was C40 at the time. And so that got left the same. So that number got diluted down with additional two-row. But the additional two-row, at a Lavi bond of, 2 or whatever it was, maybe a little bit more than that, we were gaining color there as well by just adding more and more malt. And then we took the hop load up again with a heavy focus on Simcoe and Amarillo, and started with all the same hops that we used in the Elder, but one of the big differences was we did four dry hop additions. So we would do the first dry hop, let it sit for a few days, dump the cone, add some second dry hops, and then the third and the fourth. And, I didn't know anything about biotransformation at the time. The idea was more based around, well, can we just keep adding layers of flavor on top of each other? And maybe once the first hops have been added, something will change in the beer with the second. And really what we were talking about was, to a degree, not necessarily biotransformation in the true sense, because biotransformation requires an active fermentation, but just that mindset of maybe something changes because we didn't add everything at once at a rate of, that 4 pounds per barrel. We spread it out of a pound per barrel, a pound per barrel, a pound per barrel, a pound per barrel to get 4 total. Okay. And, so I didn't know the science behind, why we did that, but it took a lot longer. It was a 6-week beer at the time. So it was twice as long as a regular elder recipe. And that was why we only did it once a year. Was it took up tank space. The yields were horrible. And then, like I always tell people, like, hey, do you want Christmas year round? Then it wouldn't be special on December 25th. So
exactly,
because we do get asked all the time, why don't you make younger more often? I was like, well, there's something special doing it once a year as well. And I love the tradition of releases like that, like Oktoberfest, the oldest tradition in, brewing a seasonal beer. Like, how cool is that? So anyways, that was the foundation of it. And the very first batch of Pliny the Younger we made was in 2005, and we added oak chips to it, and just as kind of a nod and a throwback. And I remember I added too much, and at the time, Travis Smith was my assistant brewer who went on to start Society in San Diego, and I remember him pulling a growler off the tank and taking it home before we dry hopped it, and then we dry hopped it with the oak chips, and it was a little too oaky, and we pretty much to ourselves thought we'd ruined the beer because it was a little oaky and it took too much of the hop notes off the beer. And the next year I didn't do it and carry on. And over the years we've adjusted the hop bill a little bit, but for the most part, it's still a focus on Simcoe and Amarillo.
Nice. That's a great hop combination. We used a Simcoe and Amarillo hop blend in Sublimely Self-Righteous at Stone, the black IPA. I just think that those two hops work really well together. Like Centennial and Citra to me work really well together.
With their citrus notes, tangerine, that sort of thing.
So who coined the phrase triple IPA when talking about beers like this that are over 10%?
I started using that for Younger in 2005, and we called it a triple IPA because we took, originally Pliny was our regular, what we called Russian River IPA, doubled the hops. And this was before we had started brewing Blind Pig again at Russian River, because I didn't quite have the trademark back yet. But when we started making the Younger, we just tripled the hops from our regular IPA at the time. And so I'm not sure if anyone was using it before me, but I did start using the term in 2005, and that's how up on the chalkboard it said, Pliny the Younger triple IPA, and then the elder was double IPA, and nice. Then and then we had Russian River IPA, which was more of an old school IPA. It had it was American hops, but it had like 5-6% crystal malt in it, so it definitely had more of an amber, copper maybe hue to it. But then shortly thereafter, in 2005, I was able to procure the Blind Pig trademark again, because it had lapsed and the brewery had closed 5 years before or whatever. And but trademarks take time to lapse, so it lapsed, and I jumped on it, and then we started making Blind Pig again. And so that was in 2005. There was a day when you could walk into Russian River and get 4 IPAs, and that was unheard of.
Incredible.
Pretty incredible at the time. But it took a long time to get people, and a lot of education, and that's where brew pubs and tasting rooms are great, because there's such that ability to to educate, and
Yeah.
and I love, it's so hard right now to get labor and whatnot, but we never even thought about going to a fast casual setup at both our breweries, because I just love that interaction between our bartenders and servers and our guests, and being able to talk about beer.
Yeah, it's to me, it's a mark of a very successful food and beer establishment, is having a staff that can really talk to the beers and teach people some things if they're interested in learning about it or whatever. I think that it just really builds a fan base that is unbeatable.
Yeah.
So I think we're just about out of time, but I wanted to ask you a couple things about more modern IPAs, and I believe you're brewing a hazy IPA at this point.
We do, yeah. We have a hazy, and then we have another kind of progressive IPA called Happy Hops that I jokingly call our not so hazy IPA, because it has everything that a hazy IPA has, except it's clear. And I made that before I started making Mind Circus, which is kind of our primary hazy IPA. And I made Happy Hops specifically built around what I just said, that I wanted to see if I could make a beer that smells and tastes like a hazy, but was clear. I have nothing against hazy IPAs. We make one called Mind Circus, but it's not a primary beer for us. Like, where so many breweries had to go down the hazy trail, we didn't have to. We still, Pliny is number 1, Blind Pig's number 2, and Happy Hops are number 3. So, or maybe STS, our Pilsner, is 3, and Happy Hops is 4, something like that. But Mind Circus wouldn't even be in the top 5 for us in sales, and we don't always have it on, and we bottle it more than we can it, which is odd as well.
Yeah.
But it was just for me, it was a challenge, because I remember you and I had many conversations on this, and it's hard to make beer stay hazy. It's really hard. It's really hard. And we have a couple of other hazies we do, just one-offs that we can maybe once a quarter or whatever, and they're not with where Mind Circus is using like what I would call traditional hazy, hops, Strata, Mosaic, Citra, Nelson, and a couple other hop varieties, Azaka is in there, and it's those hops somehow tend to work better. Whereas when I, do a hazy IPA using like Centennial or like some other not so new, cultivars of hops, I don't get as much impact as well. And so we still struggle with haze stability with some of the one-off hazies we do.
Yeah, so do we. We do a lot of hazy IPAs at New Realm, but we also have a number of clear IPAs as well. So it's been fun, and the challenge of figuring out how to brew them well was a good challenge as a brewer. That was
and that was what I was going to say. I love that was one of the things that really drove me to it more than the sales angle, and selling beer, because I knew in the back of my mind is like, I don't think, at least for Russian River, I don't think a hazy IPA is going to even come close. It's not going to take over Pliny. And I didn't think it would take over Blind Pig either, and it hasn't. It's not even close to it. I mean, we have Mind Circus in the tank now. We've been without a hazy for about 8 weeks now, and but I took it as a challenge. It was a great brewing challenge.
Yeah, 100% agree. So last question. Just wondering if you could talk about your take on where you see the future of IPA growing, and whether you have tried some new hop varieties that are really floating your boat, that really excite you.
Yeah,
you mentioned Talus. That's a good one.
Talus is the hop for me. I mean, Natalie and I have been rubbing that in the experimental field, the HBC 692 for probably 5 years now, and we sponsored it as the last few years before it went commercial. And sponsoring a hop is more just for fun. Yeah, you get access to it, but you're paying for it. You're, still 20% of the hops get to go out to other breweries for wherever the grower wants to send them, or broker. So, that's Talus to me I don't think there's going to be another Citra for a long time,
Yeah.
but like I said before, I think IPA is like what Chardonnay is to the wine world. It's not going anywhere. It's going to be, I think it's going to be the way that pale ale was for so many years, decade more, to the craft industry, microbrewery industry. I think that's where IPA is going to be. I think you're going to continue to see, hop growers put new hops out, but are they going to be as impactful as what's out there right now?
Yeah.
And they'll have some hits, but I'm not sure we're going to see anything like Citra Mosaic for a while. But then Talus comes along, and it's pretty impactful, and I can't get over that note, that pink grapefruit note that it has. And it's one of the few hops where what you rub in the field is what you taste in the glass.
Really?
And that's not always the case.
Right.
Right. But for me, that's what's really exciting me. Of course, when Strata came out a few years ago, and now that hop is exploding, and everyone's using that. But I haven't seen any experimentals after Talus that are really exciting me, so I think one of the things that brewers should focus on is how to become more efficient with hops. It's a conversation you and I have talked about. If you're dry hopping at what now 2 pounds per barrel is like pedestrian. We're talking breweries that are at 4 or 5 pounds per barrel or more. It's like, okay, how can you be more efficient with your process so you can get more out? And we found on the hot side, we get higher yields with the hop back than we do if it's an all pellet recipe. So the difference between Pliny brewed with 100% pellets on the hot side or whole cone in the hop back will gain like a barrel or two on the whole cones.
Yeah, that's
so it is great, and then you start talking about how many hundreds of batches of Pliny we make in a year. It really starts adding up.
Yeah. Fantastic. Yeah, I think the efficiency piece is something that you got to be a responsible brewer, and I remember when we started New Realm, and my partners really hadn't worked for IPA breweries before, and I was mentioning, hey, in the fermenter we're going to get about 80% yield on this beer, and they're like, what? And I'm like,
that's how it works.
Yeah. Anything else you'd like to add, Vinnie?
I think we covered a lot, and I think we covered a lot of the main points, as I was thinking about this conversation, before we logged in. I always keep thinking back to how few hops were available in the early years, and that's what folks like Ken Grossman had to play with, and of course Fritz Maytag before Ken started Sierra, and a lot of the other early breweries. And it's a message that I keep getting out there, and I try to put out there, because it wasn't like it is now with this just amazing selection of hops, and I'm happy that some younger brewers have rediscovered hops like Centennial and Chinook, and I know Cascade's going down, but in acreage up in the Northwest, but it's still a pretty dynamite hop. And I hope that, brewers continue to rediscover these old varieties, or things like Comet that have come back,
So, that's a good one.
Yeah.
It's, I love those old school hops. That's what I cut my teeth on, and they will always have a place in my beers, hopefully.
We Natalie and I rebrewed the inaugural ale recipe on our SS Brewtech system. Was the first beer we ran through, and then we re-released it, and so it was really cool. It was fun for Natalie. We hadn't brewed together for a long time, but it was fun to dust off that old recipe and bring it back.
That is cool. What a great way to commission that brew house.
Yeah, exactly. a little bit nicer than the equipment I had at Blind Pig, that's for sure.
Awesome. Well, Vinnie, thank you so much. It's
of course.
Just always a pleasure to talk to you. Always a lot of fun. Love what you do and your insight to the business. And, I look forward to seeing you soon and having a beer.
I look forward to it. Hopefully it'll happen in the next couple months. Thanks,
Yep.
Mitch.
All right, Vinny, take
All right.
care.
Yep.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Wow. That's like drinking from a fire hose. That was awesome. I I knew when we went through this, you guys said it was a fantastic discussion and you couldn't bring yourself to cut anything out. And now I know why.
It was a lot of fun. Like I said earlier, we had talked about doing a 15-minute brief conversation, and it just kept going, and we just kept talking about the things that we love about IPA. So it was, it was one of the highlights of my summer, definitely, to have that conversation with Vinny. And I'm hoping I get to go see his new brewery next week, if all goes well. So we'll, hopefully we'll get to have that beer together and enjoy it.
Well, I feel much better prepared the next time I judge IPAs too. I mean, if you don't know all this background, I mean, it's really hard to, I guess, fully appreciate what you're tasting. Well, this is fantastic. We have 12 questions, and if somebody wants to jump in there and add a few, what I would encourage you at this point, though, is vote up the most important questions because it is getting on in the day. And Mitch has a presentation after this, and we don't want it to get too late. So we'll take the most highly voted questions. So again, I would encourage you, and just so you know, Mitch, I mean, Estevan said, "Amazing, thanks God." God, amazing, thanks guys. I hadn't had that much beer, I really hadn't. Joseph says, "Very good presentation." James says that was great. Jim says, "Hell of a conversation." Tim says, "Awesome." You have, looks like over 1,300 registrations in this event, which is a record for gourmet brewing. So
nice. Nice.
You guys are awesome. Well, let's switch to the questions. Let's see whose is most popular. Frank Christian has a great question. I'm interested in this one too. What is your thoughts on hop burn?
Thank you. No, that's it. So hop burn, I can't stand it. I think, there are, hazy IPAs run the gamut of flavor profiles, and that's just one segment of hazy IPAs that I don't like. I like hops to be bitter. I like them to be clean, but I don't like them to present that kind of a flavor in my beer or mouth sensation or whatever it is. Balance in brewing is always going to be important, whether it's a beer that's heavily slanted towards hops or a beer that's not. Whatever you're brewing, you got to have some balance. And when you get into hop burn, you're out of balance, in my opinion.
So what creates it? What causes it?
Just using a lot of hops, using too many hops, more hops than you need. And I will tell you, I've seen a lot of hazy IPA recipes and some really good ones, and some of the best ones don't use 5, 6, 10 pounds per barrel of hops. They're very restrained in their hop usage on a weight basis, but they get tremendous hop character out of them. And I think that to me is a skill and something that brewers, who know how to brew really do a good job with.
So as an engineer, I'm always looking for the science versus the art. And what I hear you saying, it may be more art than science. But in the comments, you mentioned, I think 120 IBUs was about all you could get into the wort.
Yeah.
Are you saying if you've calculated that number and you're trying to throw in there, 160 IBUs, that you're risking hop burn? I mean, just to try and create some rules of thumb?
Yeah, I don't think hop burn comes from brewhouse hopping and hops that are boiled. I think it comes from excessive dry hopping later in the process. So, I've had beers that, the brewers calculated out 300 IBUs or 500 IBUs, and they were fine, because you get a point where you just can't extract anything else from those hops. But with dry hopping, it's a little bit different because you are contributing things that aren't removed by the boil. And so you just get this massive hop presence that at times can go over the top and be too far forward.
So is it sort of like barrel aging? You really need to be tasting it if you're dry hopping and just be careful?
Yeah, I think so. Again, it goes back to balance, and just not overdoing something. Too much of a good thing is not good, right?
Yeah, it is one of the most unpleasant things I will have to say that I experience in beer. I mean, because it's like too much red pepper or something like that. It is a phenomenally unpleasant characteristic. Well, Frank, great question, and it was extremely popular. But right behind it, and I don't have your whole name, because you didn't put it in there, but you have the second most popular question. So, Mitch, what do you think? What's your opinion of the best dry hop and best whirlpool hop?
Oh my gosh, I don't know if I can answer that. I think it depends on what I'm trying to do. I think, there are some studies that I just saw published within the last few months from, I think it was from Yakima Chief Hop Union. And they were looking at how hop flavors from whirlpool additions are retained throughout the fermentation process. And the surprising thing about it is there's a very wide range of how much flavor impact is retained through whirlpool hopping, and it really depends on the variety. I know Centennial was one that did very well, but from a standpoint of whirlpool hopping, I think a lot of it is based on trial and error and just trying things and saying, okay, the hop character isn't hanging out. It's not, I've just wasted a bunch of hops adding it here because they got scrubbed out by the fermentation, and then other hops don't typically. So it's interesting stuff. I think, one of the things that Vinnie and I didn't talk about was the amount of research that's going on into these new ways of hopping beers. And there are universities and brewing organizations that are putting some effort and funding studies into understanding things like biotransformation and hop burn and that kind of stuff. And, so there's still a lot to be learned. Right now, most of the knowledge is more empirical, but soon, we'll have some data to back a lot of that up. As far as dry hopping, I think it just depends on the beer and what hops you like. I love Centennial as a dry hop. I love Cascade as a dry hop. I love Galaxy as a dry hop. To me, it's about what you want in your beer. If you want something that's dank and garlicky, that's requires certain hop varieties. If you want something that's piney, that requires different hop varieties. If you want tropical fruit, that's a completely different set of hops. So, it just depends on what you're trying to brew.
So I love El Dorado, and I'm not a brewer, but would you put that in the dry or the whirlpool?
I like it in the dry hop. I use a lot of El Dorado. We started using El Dorado pretty early on in its life when I was at Stone, and we came out with a beer called Delicious IPA that had a lot of El Dorado in it. And it's a favorite hop of mine. It turns out that El Dorado is a very good hop for biotransformation as well. So when you throw it in mid-fermentation, you get a tremendous amount of juicy character, orange juice character off of that hop, which is unusual because that's not what it comes across as if you use it as a straight dry hop. It's more lemon and lemon candy and a little bit of licorice. And, but if you throw it into the fermentation, you get a lot of orange juice.
Well, I think it's a phenomenal hop, particularly blended with others. All right, great question. And that was my buddy Adam Ranke. He is up at the Malt Club in Asheville, North Carolina. So good question there, Adam. Michael has the next most popular question. Going back to Mitch's comment about Liberty Ale and Ballantine, was Ballantine the basis for Chico yeast?
Yeah, that's the conventional wisdom when I first started brewing was that Sierra Nevada's yeast was recovered from Ballantine. I could never get a confirmation from anybody at Sierra Nevada about that. but they didn't deny it either. And so it's one of those things that I think they keep as kind of a trade secret of where they got their yeast. But, unless somebody has seen Ken Grossman or Steve Dressler say something about where they got their first yeast strains from. But I've asked specifically when I talked to Ken Grossman for my book and talked to him about Celebration Ale. I asked him if it was the Ballantine yeast that they were using, and he said, it's a yeast strain that I had in my bank, and that's as far as he would go. So, yeah, but that's what I've heard. I have heard the same thing, and that thought has been out there since the 1980s.
Oh, unconfirmed thought.
Yeah, unconfirmed.
Well, I'll ask the question again. I do get the opportunity. I don't get the opportunity to talk to Ken very often, but I do get the opportunity to talk to some of the other brewers. Maybe they will let us in on the secret.
Maybe.
Next question. Looks like Rick has the most popular question. Rick S. At what temperature do you find dry hopping to be the most effective?
Warmer is better by and large, but you've got to balance that with some other things in the brewing process. So, you're going to extract a lot more flavor with a warmer dry hop. But the problem is if you dry hop it too warm, you've got a lot of yeast in suspension, which may or may not be a bad thing. For a brewery that brews a lot of IPAs and you require recovering the yeast off of an IPA fermenter, it's better to chill the tank down to 60 degrees Fahrenheit, for example, and let that yeast settle out, pull it off before you dry hop it. But if you're doing, a biotransformation at fermentation temperature, you're going to get a lot of character off of that. So, as a brewer, you always have to balance those things. I remember we were looking at those kind of things when I first, my first few years at Stone. And when Stone IPA started really taking off in the, 2009, 2010 timeframe, we started having to recover yeast from Stone IPA, which we had never done before. And of course, everybody at Stone was deathly afraid of trying to pull yeast off an IPA. And I'm like, let's pull the yeast off and check it out, but that really drove our process of chilling the beer down to 60 degrees Fahrenheit and letting a lot of the yeast settle into the cone. But you get more flavor off a warmer dry hop, definitely. I don't like cold dry hopping. I don't like processing beer to bright and at 32 degrees adding more hops because I just don't think you get a lot out of it.
So going back to the most popular question, which was hop burn, is there anything in that higher temperature versus lower temperature?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't have enough experience with it to really know.
Gosh, if you don't know, who would?
Well, I've avoided hop burn in our beers, so I have never been able to put any science to it.
I got you. You don't have it. That's okay.
Yeah.
All right. Next question. Looks like Clive has the next one. What temperature are you guys drinking your beer at? What do you recommend?
It depends on the beer, I think. But I tend to like, just under 50 degrees Fahrenheit, 45 to 50 is my preference. I don't like beer ice cold because you lose a lot of the flavor and some of the complexity. But if I'm drinking a cask conditioned ale in the UK or somewhere in the United States, I like it a little bit warmer just because it really brings out the flavors.
Yeah. All but an industrial beer. And I find those really don't go over very well unless they're ice cold.
Yeah, they need to be cold. Because really the major flavor contributor in like an American lager is the yeast. And, you get some sulfur and that tends to come out a little bit more, when the beer's warmer.
Good question, Clive. Mike Dixon has our next question. Since Ballantine IPA has been mentioned more than once, actually it was mentioned quite a lot in our chatting, how far off the mark is the Ballantine IPA that was reintroduced by Pabst in 2014?
It was very different, and actually I had some communications with the brewmaster at Pabst who put that beer together, and he had done some sort of podcast or radio interview, and he had read my book and called it out specifically in his interview. So I reached out to him and just to thank him, and he said, "Yeah, we modernized it. So they were using modern hops. Now the original Ballantine IPA was a lot of bouillon hops, which there were some talk about that on the chat here, but." They were using modern American hops in that beer. And I thought it was a really good beer. I think they were doing some hop distillation and catching some oils and throwing that into the secondary tank, the aging tank. But I know for a fact that they were using more modern hops than the original Ballantine used. And, obviously. And, it was a different beer, and he admitted that. He was like, "Yeah, it's a different beer. We didn't think that a beer with a 1930s hop flavor profile was going to do well in today's market. So we tried to capture some elements of the Ballantine, and then modernize it to make it a little more palatable for today's beer drinker."
I guess that's not a surprise. I mean, they're in the business to make money.
Yeah, and here's a comment from Mike Stein there. There was not a year-long aging process in this beer. It was a pretty standard IPA.
Next question. I bet you this is a short question from Tim. So, Mitch, would you brew an English mild?
Sure. Yeah, I'd love to. If people will buy it, I'll brew it. I love the style. I love English beers in general, whether they're historical or modern or whatever. But the problem with an English mild is a bad word in the United States. People look at that and say, I'm not drinking that. And certainly we have brewed a mild at New Realm. I could never brew one as Stone. That would not have fallen into Stone's camp. And Greg Cook was very adamant about not brewing certain beer styles. And English mild would have been one of the ones he would have vetoed. But I did, we did do one at New Realm, and, it sold reasonably well, but it definitely wasn't a barn burner, and it had a very limited appeal. So we just, I'd love to brew them. I'd love to see those styles take off again so we could brew them, and we'll see what happens.
Well, I like that question, but I thought there was an interesting comment, a little bit of discussion in the chat, and you might have seen it, Mitch, where this question was asked to Mike Karnowski, which was the most difficult beer of the series to brew. And if I understood Mike correctly, and Mike, I'll turn your camera and mic on if you want to add to the conversation.
That's a dangerous thing to do, is just to turn the random. You never know what you're going to see.
I was trying to give you a little heads up. So you had indicated in the chat that maybe the most difficult of all the beers to brew was the 1994 clone. And you mentioned oxygen, and I just wondered if that was a worthy discussion, just briefly.
I don't know if it comes into play so much with doing the English stuff. They weren't concerned with oxygen pickup back then. And I think as homebrewers, we've all kind of realized over the years, if we want to recreate these English beers, really we need to oxidize them, because that's the flavor that we're getting. I mean, we're all drinking year-old Bass ales, and then when we make them fresh, they don't taste right. So the missing flavor in these old English styles is oxidation. But as far as the American styles go, the oxygen is just the worst. I mean, you try to minimize it at every step. And I really did a lot. I mean, I would fill up an entire fermenter with water and push it out with CO2 before pushing beer into it, purging everything. And I literally hand bottled every one of these American IPAs with a beer gun, 2 barrels with a beer gun. So I was doing my best. If if they suffered a little bit in the packaging and the shipping, it's just, it comes with the territory, and it's the nature of the beast. I'm sure every commercial brewer, the IPA brewer, is just concerned about their DO readings on their canning line. I mean, that's probably the number one concern of commercial brewers, is just checking that DO, the dissolved oxygen on their cans. That's probably the most important thing. Hop selection would be below that, I would say.
Absolutely. Totally agree.
Well, an interesting derivation of that is I did a program on dank, and I ended up buying a commercial beer. I won't name the brewery, and it was 60 days within its brewing date, and it was oxidized. Big brewery. So are dank hops any more prone to oxygen degrading than other hops, or are there other hops that are more prone to oxygen than others?
Mitch, take it.
I would say that it's very varietal dependent, and like Vinny and I talked about there, a hop like Citra, you throw it in as a beautiful beer, but 30 days after you've dry hopped a beer with Citra, it's fallen off a cliff. Now it doesn't necessarily relate to oxidation; it's just a loss of hop flavor. And there are, the New Zealand hops and the Australian hops that I've used tend to stick around a lot longer, whether they're dank or not. And I'm not sure what causes that. And Vinny and I have actually talked about that. We're like, what's going on? Why do American hops fall off? And why do Australian hops or English hops or German hops tend to stick around a little bit more in the beer? And I'm not scientific enough to understand the chemistry behind what's going on there, but I think it's fascinating from a brewing standpoint.
Yeah, I think what's going to be discovered in the next couple years is the relationship of hop terpenes, and the monoterpenes versus the sesquiterpenes, and how they volatilize off, and you can create a better terpene profile that'll create longevity in the hop aroma by going for these more complex terpenes like the sesquiterpenes rather than monoterpenes that would blow off easier. And I think there's also, I know I was kind of not into talking about future of IPA because it's kind of a silly concept to talk about hypothetical, but I think terpenes are going to be, it's driving the modern cannabis scene. Because they're finding that certain terpenes really create certain highs and flavors. And we're going to obviously, craft beer and craft cannabis are going to be growing together side by side. And we're going to find out that things like myrcene in hops create kind of a more sleepy buzz. If you drink an IPA that's heavy in myrcene, you might go, want to go to sleep. And that might be a cool marketing concept. It's going to be tricky for us to find, that legal. We're not allowed to put any medical claims on beer, but I think there's some way we'll be able to say, look, this is a beer you drink before bed. This is a beer you drink, while you're mowing the lawn and you want to stay up more. More of an effect-driven beer than we're even conceiving of right now.
So what I hear on DO, dissolved oxygen, is it seems more prevalent in American hops than, I guess, other hops that we're.
No, it has nothing to do with the hops themselves. Dissolved oxygen is just a process-driven thing where you pick up oxygen as you transfer from thing to thing. But this has nothing to do with the hops themselves.
Yeah,
I'm just saying the degradation is more obvious, maybe.
No, I think you're confusing. What was it? HSO? Is that what it is, Mitch? The degradation of the hops over
HSI.
time. HSI,
yeah. I think I just, my point was that there are certain hop varieties that tend to have better staying power in beers than others, and oxidation is going to hasten the loss but it's really, there is a varietal phenomenon going on, with hop flavor and how long it sticks around in the beer. And, I think it's, Citra is my main example. That's the one I always use. Citra, it's such a beautiful hop, and then you throw it into a beer and you dry hop with Citra, and 30 days later, the flavor's gone. Whether you have good control over your oxygen or not, it's gone. And I remember, back when we were doing, so there was a year at Stone that we came out with Enjoy by IPA, and we came out with Ruination 10th Anniversary IPA, and I had some trouble getting the hops. The original recipes were flip-flops. So the original recipe for Enjoy by IPA was what became Stone Ruination or Ruin 10 IPA. And, the ironic thing about it is Enjoy by IPA used a whole bunch of different hop varieties, and it used a lot of New Zealand and Australian hops. And that beer had a longer shelf life than Ruin 10 IPA. And Enjoy by, of course, was known as the beer with a 35-day shelf life. And, and I didn't tell that story very often because I didn't want to ruin the marketing buzz, but Enjoy by IPA has a better aging potential than Ruin 10 by far.
Well, and Ron,
okay, can you hear me now?
I'm trying my best to bring your camera on, but I can't.
Hey, Mitch.
Mitch,
can I ask you a question? I've talked to a lot of brewers, and we feel that Cascade has really changed over time. Do you remember? I mean, it's always difficult to separate out your palate drift over decades, but have you noticed? I seem to remember Cascade as being a very different flavor profile and aroma profile than it is now.
Yeah, and I think that's natural with a lot of hop varieties. I think Amarillo has changed a lot as well. Part of that, I think, is due to the spread of growing of the hops in different farms and terroir, and which is a very real thing with hop varieties, I think. And then part of it is just the natural evolution of the hop variety as it goes through several seasons of growing. And I've had conversations with growers about this, and the Amarillo one is particularly troublesome, as the growing, originally for the first decade of Amarillo, there was only a few farms that were allowed to grow it, and then it spread out, and it's very different now, in my opinion. Cascade, I think, has changed. I think the closest thing to the original Cascade that I've used is from the Siegel Ranch, John Siegel's farm, and he's got a hop called High Oil Cascade. That to me is reminiscent of that 1980s, early 1990s Cascade that we all fell in love with, and that's the best one out there. Otherwise, you get a whole bunch of different options, and you get a whole bunch of different flavor profiles off Cascade depending on where they're grown and how old the rootstock is and all that kind of stuff.
I think Ron wanted to make a comment. For whatever reason, his camera will not come on.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Ron.
Oh, you can hear me. Okay, you can't see me. That's fine. Okay. Oh no, I mean, I just wanted to.
It's the ghost of Ron.
Yeah, because obviously, whenever you start talking, I want to jump in and make some comments. But yeah. No. As long as I'm heard, I don't care. Continue on. I don't know what I wanted to say, actually. Probably something really annoying.
Well, just speak up. Your mic will still be on. We'll continue on. So, bottom line, go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, I can hear you, and we can speak, so that's fine. Sorry, I'm just being really disruptive here, aren't I?
No, you're welcome. You're welcome in.
Absolutely.
So Mitch, Mitch, you still doing your presentation, or is that did I miss that?
You missed that.
I can do whatever you guys want. We talked a lot about it when in the discussion with Vinnie, so I'll blow through some of it and make it really quick.
But no, you missed my presentation. Yeah.
Well, Mitch, why don't we go to that next? But I think Jane's got a good question, and I think maybe this is where you were going, Ron. She wondered if the oxidation profile of British ales was possibly what you were going to mention. I know I'm interested in that. Can you keep that real short?
The oxidation profile.
Well, Mike,
it was never
element
intended.
In the flavor.
It's just the way American homebrewers had to come to grips with the flavors they were tasting.
Oxidate. I mean, God, this is one of the really, really complicated things. But yeah, I mean, when you look at cask beer, yeah, there was always some oxidation in there. That's part of the thing that made the beer taste really good. You know, that's the thing. When you have a cask beer, it's open. You know, it's got oxygen going in there. It's doing all this stuff with it. That's one of the reasons you get all these complex flavors. You know, and you know, people can say keg beer can always taste as good. No, it can't. Keg beer can never ever have the complexities that cask conditioned beer does because of all. You know, and oxidation is one of the things. You've got the oxygen going into the cask. You've got all these things going on. One of the best beers I've ever tasted in the United States was when the guys in Boston brewed up for me this 1830s British beer. We had it on cask in Deep Element in Boston, and you know, the first day it tasted just like the keg beer. 3 days in, it was just absolutely amazing. It was like nothing else. It had improved so much. And that proved to me that cask beer is so much better than just normal, you know, pressurized beer or anything. One of the best beers that I've ever tasted in my life. Pretty Things. That's who it was who did it. Pretty Things. Who were the one. You know, Mike, you're one of my favorite brewers in the States, along with Pretty Things, because you do all the stuff the proper way. And I've loved so many of the beers you've brewed, and I'm just so annoyed that everyone else has been tasting these beers tonight, and I've not had any of them. I've just been sat here, just having to make do with St. Bernardus Abts, and everyone else has had all these lovely old IPAs, but I'm going to come back there, Mike, and you're going to.
We're actually planning a future event with Ron for Asheville Beer Week, where we're thinking of doing World War. Sorry.
It's loud.
We we try to bring Ron in every year to do a fun thing like a tap takeover of turn the brewery into a London pub or his hometown pub. We're thinking of doing World Wars this year, so I thought that would be a lot of fun. Friday would be World War I, Saturday would be World War II, and I want to have like bombs going off.
World War III, when it all goes really crazy.
I want to have a lot of gunpowder smell going off and air raid sirens, and try to get into the mindset of what it was like to be trying to get a pint in the middle of World War I or World War II. It's something that's very difficult to wrap your modern mind around, and I think it would be a lot of fun and kind of ridiculous, which is the best combination.
Yeah, well, right. Mike, one of the things I most want to do is to get back to Asheville. It's I've got 2 vaccinations. I should be able to travel anywhere, shouldn't I?
I think so. You're welcome at Zebulon if you're properly vaccinated. And don't forget, we got our band. We got to practice up. We got a band. Ron and I called the was it the Chavs?
Yeah.
We do some old kinks. You know, it's
Standell's the best.
All right. Yeah. Well, we do a handful of songs. We'll try to get a gig coming up.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. We'll do a live stream from there, Mike.
Yeah.
All right. So we got
you're also involved, aren't you? It was all the 3 of us, wasn't it?
What was that?
Yeah. So the guy who's there in the center, he's also involved in this, I thought.
Oh, Mitch.
Yeah.
Mitch is the rhythm guitar player in the band.
Yeah.
I'm in.
All day and all the night on 3. 1,
1, 2, 3.
we'll figure it out. We're professionals.
Okay, I'm willing to be the camera guy. I'll have to be behind the scenes.
It'll put Spinal Tap to shame.
All right, Merlin has got our next question, and we might have to move on from here. So Merlin says, given Mitch Steele's Hazy IPA entry at New Realm, what does he have to say about the research led by Scott Janisch?
Yeah, and I wasn't sure we were going to get to this, so I put in a comment there, but I think it's fantastic. I think anytime people put the effort into understanding the science about what's going on in brewing, and it's a worthwhile endeavor, and I really appreciate it. I mentioned earlier, a lot of the research is being done at places like Oregon State University, and we're learning a tremendous amount of how hops behave in beer, things that were just intuition before they're either being confirmed or reevaluated. And I think it's wonderful stuff. And I do have Scott's book. I'm about 2 chapters in, so I haven't been able to find the time to give it a full read, but I'm fascinated by the ideas and what he's trying to do and what he's trying to explain and figure out.
I agree. Scott did a program, and it was like drinking from a fire hose also. All right. So I think we're going to have to keep this moving along quickly. I know there's a couple of questions left, but Mitch, I think we'll transition to your program next, if you're good with that.
Yeah, I'm good.
All right. So again, I'm going to have to do this session switch, so I hope that wasn't uncomfortable for anybody. So this will end. I will transition. We'll kind of have a new screen. You shouldn't have to do anything on your end. But Ron, Mike, and Mitch, I will have to bring you back on screen. Okay. So just look for that to pop up. So give us about 60 seconds. It might give you a chance for a bio break if you need it. So we'll catch up in just a second. Thank you.